The cottage looked perfect in the fading sunlight, its weathered stone walls and thatched roof promising the quaint country life we'd dreamed of. But as I fumbled with the old brass key, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us from behind the leaded glass windows. "Come on, Dad. I want to see my new room." My daughter Sarah tugged at my sleeve, her excitement momentarily dispelling my unease. I forced a smile and finally managed to unlock the heavy wooden door. The musty scent of age and disuse hit us as we stepped inside. My wife, Lisa, wrinkled her nose but kept her voice cheerful. "Nothing a good airing out won't fix, right?" I nodded, trying to match her optimism. We'd saved for years to escape the chaos of city life, to give Sarah a chance to grow up somewhere peaceful. This was supposed to be our fresh start. As we explored the cottage that first evening, the creaks and groans of the old structure set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the house settling, that all the strange noises were perfectly normal in a building this old. But when a door slammed shut upstairs while we were all in the kitchen, I couldn't explain it away so easily. "I'll go check it out," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Lisa gave me a concerned look but didn't say anything as I headed up the narrow staircase. The upper floor was cloaked in shadows, the fading daylight barely penetrating the small windows. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my hand trailing along the rough plaster wall. The door to what we'd planned as Sarah's room stood slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, just as we'd left it earlier. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, in the dust on the windowsill, was a single, perfect handprint, far too small to belong to any of us. My heart pounding, I backed out of the room and hurried downstairs. I didn't mention what I'd seen to Lisa or Sarah. There had to be a logical explanation, and I didn't want to frighten them on our first night in our new home. That night, as we lay in our creaky bed, the sounds of the countryside keeping us awake, Lisa whispered, "Do you think we made the right decision? Moving out here?" I pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Of course we did. It's just going to take some getting used to, that's all." But as the words left my mouth, a long, low moan echoed through the house. We both sat bolt upright, straining our ears in the darkness. "What was that?" Lisa's voice was barely audible. "Probably just the wind," I said, not believing it myself. "Old houses make all sorts of noises." We eventually drifted off to sleep, but our rest was far from peaceful. I dreamed of dark shapes moving just out of sight, of whispered voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The next morning, exhausted and on edge, we tried to go about the business of settling into our new home. Sarah seemed oblivious to the tension, happily exploring every nook and cranny of the cottage. It was while unpacking boxes in the living room that I first noticed the scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. At first, I dismissed it as mice, not unexpected in an old country house. But as the day wore on, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to follow us from room to room, always just on the other side of the plaster. Lisa noticed it too, her eyes widening as a particularly loud scratch came from behind the fireplace. "Maybe we should call an exterminator," she suggested, her voice tight with forced calm. I nodded, grateful for the pretense of normalcy. "I'll look one up right now." But when I tried to use my phone, I found there was no signal. The landline we'd had installed gave nothing but static when I picked up the receiver. We were cut off. That night, things escalated. We were jolted awake by Sarah's scream, piercing through the darkness. We rushed to her room to find her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "There was a lady," she sobbed as Lisa gathered her into her arms. "A lady in old-fashioned clothes. She was standing right there, watching me." I searched the room, my heart racing, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no explanation for what Sarah had seen. As I turned back to comfort my daughter, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw a small antiquated doll lying on the floor, a doll I was certain hadn't been there when we'd put Sarah to bed. The next day, we were all on edge. Strange occurrences seemed to multiply by the hour. Books would fall from shelves with no one near them. The temperature would plummet in certain rooms, our breath fogging the air even as bright sunlight streamed through the windows. And always, there was the feeling of being watched. Lisa and I tried to rationalize it, to come up with logical explanations, but when we found Sarah talking to an empty corner of the kitchen, describing in detail a little boy that neither of us could see, we knew we couldn't deny it any longer. "We need help," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "This isn't normal. None of this is normal." I agreed, but with our phones still not working and our car mysteriously refusing to start, we felt trapped. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the thought of walking along the deserted country lanes with night approaching filled me with dread. As darkness fell, the activity in the house reached a fever pitch. Objects flew across rooms of their own accord. Disembodied voices whispered from empty corners. And the scratching in the walls grew so loud it was like something was trying to claw its way out. We huddled together in the living room, jumping at every noise, every shadow. Sarah had long since cried herself into an exhausted sleep, curled up on the sofa between us. "What are we going to do?" Lisa's voice was hoarse, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. I opened my mouth to respond, to offer some words of comfort or reassurance, but at that moment, every light in the house went out at once. We were plunged into total darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the constant scratching had ceased. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over. Then, from upstairs, came the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. Thump, 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 moving from room to room, getting closer. Lisa clutched my arm so tightly it hurt. I could hear her ragged breathing, feel the tremors running through her body. I wanted to run, to grab Sarah and flee into the night, but I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. They were coming down now. Slow, deliberate. The old wood creaking under unseen weight. I finally found my voice. "Who's there?" I called out, hating how weak and frightened I sounded. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness. Old, cracked, filled with malice. "This is our home," it said, "and you are not welcome here." The words were followed by a chorus of whispers, dozens of voices all around us, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Not welcome, not welcome, not welcome." Sarah woke with a start, her scream joining the cacophony of ghostly voices. The furniture began to shake, pictures flew off the walls, and a wind that had no source whipped around us, icy cold and smelling of decay. In that moment of pure terror, I found the strength to move. I scooped Sarah up in my arms, grabbed Lisa's hand and ran for the door. We burst out into the cool night air, not stopping until we reached the road. As we stood there, gasping for breath, I turned to look back at the cottage. It stood silent and dark, looking for all the world like a normal, quaint country home. But in one of the upstairs windows, I saw a figure, a woman in old-fashioned clothes, her face twisted in a malevolent smile. As I watched, she raised her hand and waved, a mocking farewell. Then she was gone, and the window was empty once more. We didn't go back for our things. We walked through the night, following the road until we reached the nearest town. It was days before we could bring ourselves to talk about what had happened, to try and make sense of the nightmare we'd endured. In the end, we never returned to the cottage. We left it, and all the horrors it contained, behind us. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear those whispers, still feel those unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. And I wonder if we ever truly escaped, or if a part of us will always be trapped in that house, forever unwelcome guests in someone else's home. The security camera feed flickered, and for a split second I saw something that shouldn't be there. A shadow where there should be light, a movement where all should be still. In that moment, I knew this night shift would be unlike any other. My name's Mike, and I've been working security at the City Museum for going on 5 years now. It's usually a pretty quiet gig, just me, the cameras, and millions of dollars worth of artifacts to keep an eye on. But tonight was different. I leaned closer to the bank of monitors, my coffee forgotten as I scanned each screen. Everything looked normal at first glance. Empty halls, dimly lit exhibits, the occasional reflection off a glass case. But then I saw it again. A flicker in the Egyptian wing, like someone had walked in front of the camera and disappeared. "What the hell?" I muttered, reaching for the controls to rewind the footage. But before I could, another camera glitched, this time in the medieval Europe section. My heart started to race. One camera malfunction, I could explain away. Two, in different parts of the museum. That was no coincidence. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, hesitating for just a moment before stepping out of the security office. The hallway stretched before me, shadows dancing in the beam of my light. Every instinct told me to go back, to call for backup, but I knew that by the time anyone arrived, whatever was happening could be long over. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the marble floors as I made my way towards the Egyptian wing. The air felt heavy, charged with an electricity I couldn't explain. As I rounded the corner, my flashlight beam caught the glint of gold from Tutankhamun's death mask. I swept the light across the room, half expecting to see a figure dart behind a sarcophagus. But there was nothing. Just ancient artifacts standing silent watch as they had for centuries. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. A smudge on the glass case housing a collection of canopic jars. I moved closer, my breath fogging the glass as I leaned in to inspect it. It was a handprint. Fresh, by the looks of it. "This is Mike," I said into my radio, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I've got signs of a possible intruder in the Egyptian wing. Requesting backup." Static was my only reply. I tried again, but the radio remained stubbornly silent. Great. Either it was broken, or something was interfering with the signal. Either way, I was on my own. I made my way back to the security office, my senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps. By the time I reached the relative safety of my desk, I was drenched in sweat. The cameras were still acting up, showing more glitches and unexplained movements. I tried the landline, but it was dead too. No cell signal either. It was like the whole museum had been cut off from the outside world. That's when I noticed it. The timestamp on the camera feeds. They were all wrong, showing times from hours ago. With shaking hands, I pulled up the archived footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The footage showed a group of people entering the museum after closing. They moved with purpose, clearly knowing where they were going. I watched in horror as they systematically made their way through the exhibits, somehow disabling alarms and bypassing security measures. But it was what they were doing that really got to me. They weren't just stealing artifacts, they were replacing them, with perfect replicas, as far as I could tell. If I hadn't been watching it happen, I never would have known the difference. I fast-forwarded through the footage, my heart pounding as I watched them work their way through the museum. They were professionals, no doubt about it, and they were almost done. The timestamp on the last bit of footage was just minutes ago. They were still here. I jumped up from my chair, knocking over my cold coffee in the process. I had to do something, had to stop them. But what could one security guard do against a team of professional thieves? I grabbed my flashlight again, along with the pepper spray I kept in my desk. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard voices, soft, but getting closer. I ducked into an alcove, trying to slow my breathing as I listened. "That's the last of it," a man's voice said. "Let's get out of here before sunrise." "What about the guard?" This voice was female, low and husky. "Taken care of," a third voice replied. "He'll be out cold for hours." By the time anyone realizes what's happened, we'll be long gone. I frowned, out cold, but I was right here, very much awake. Then it hit me. They must have gotten to Jim, the other night guard. He usually patrolled the West Wing while I monitored the cameras. I hadn't seen him all night. Hadn't even thought to check on him. Guilt and anger warred inside me. I should have known something was wrong when Jim didn't check in. Now he could be hurt, or worse, and these thieves were about to get away with the crime of the century. I couldn't let that happen. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my hiding place. "Freeze!" I shouted, pointing my flashlight at the group. "Security! Don't move!" For a moment, they looked startled. There were 5 of them, all dressed in black, carrying large duffel bags that I assumed were full of priceless artifacts. Then the one in front, a tall man with cold eyes, smiled. Well, he said. "Looks like we missed one." He turned to his companions. "Take care of him." 2 of them started towards me. I backed up, fumbling for my pepper spray. "Stay back," I warned, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've called for backup. The police are on their way." The woman laughed. "No, you haven't," she said. "All communications are jammed. You're all alone. Rent a cop." She was right, and we both knew it, but I couldn't give up. I thought of all the history in this museum, of the thousands of people who came here every day to learn and wonder. I couldn't let these thieves take that away. In that moment of distraction, one of them lunged at me. I managed to dodge him, spraying wildly with the pepper spray. Someone cursed, and I heard the sound of coughing, but then a fist connected with my jaw, sending me sprawling. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight skittering across the floor. Through dazed eyes, I saw the leader bend down to pick it up. "You should have stayed in your office," he said, his voice almost gentle. "Now we'll have to do this the hard way." I tried to get up, but a boot on my chest kept me down. I could taste blood in my mouth, could feel the panic rising as I realized how utterly outmatched I was. But then, miraculously, I heard it. Sirens, growing louder by the second. The thieves heard it too. Their heads snapped up, looking towards the windows where blue and red lights were now visible. "How?" the woman hissed. "The alarms never went off." I managed to grin, even though it hurt. "Silent alarm," I lied. "Triggered as soon as you entered the building. Guess your tech isn't as good as you thought." The leader's face twisted in anger. He raised the flashlight, and I braced myself for the blow. But it never came. Instead, the sound of breaking glass filled the air, followed by shouts of "Police, freeze!" What happened next was a blur. The boot on my chest disappeared as the thieves scattered. I heard more shouting, the sound of running feet, a gunshot that echoed through the cavernous halls of the museum. And then, suddenly, it was over. I found myself being helped to my feet by a concerned-looking police officer. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her eyes scanning me for injuries. I nodded, wincing at the movement. "Yeah, I think so." "Did you get them?" She smiled. "We got them, all 5, plus the artifacts they were trying to steal. You did good, holding them off like that." I sagged in relief, the adrenaline finally wearing off. As the officer led me outside to a waiting ambulance, I saw the thieves being loaded into police cars. The leader caught my eye as he was being put in the back of a cruiser. The look he gave me was pure hatred. I should have been scared, but instead, I felt a surge of pride. I had done my job. I had protected the museum and everything in it. As the paramedics checked me over, I watched the sun begin to rise over the city. In a few hours, the museum would open as usual. Visitors would come, marveling at artifacts that were thousands of years old, never knowing how close they came to losing them forever. And me, I'd be back tomorrow night, watching over it all. Because that's what I do. That's who I am. I'm the night guard, the unseen protector of history itself. And no matter what comes, I'll be ready. The scratching sound from my closet grew louder, more insistent. I froze, textbook forgotten in my lap, as the noise changed from a gentle scrape to a frantic scrabbling. Whatever was in there, it wanted out, and I was terrified to find out what it might be. My name's Jess, and up until tonight, my biggest worry was passing my Psych 101 midterm. Funny how quickly priorities can change when you're faced with the possibility of a monster in your closet. It had started innocently enough. Just another late-night study session in my dorm room, fueled by too much coffee and the creeping dread of impending exams. My roommate, Sarah, was out for the night, probably at another party. I envied her ability to balance academics and social life, and while I was stuck here, drowning in a sea of highlighters and sticky notes, the first scratch was so faint I barely noticed it. I glanced up from my textbook, cocking my head to listen. Nothing. Just the usual ambient sounds of dorm life, distant music, muffled voices, the hum of my ancient mini-fridge. I shrugged it off, turning back to my studies, but then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate scraping sound like fingernails on wood, and it was coming from my closet. My heart rate picked up. I set my textbook aside, eyes fixed on the closed closet door. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid even as I did so. What did I expect, and for someone to answer? Silence greeted me. I let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through my messy hair. "Get it together, Jess," I muttered. "You're losing it." I picked up my book again, determined to focus, but the words swam before my eyes, my concentration shot. Every few seconds, my gaze would dart to the closet, half expecting to see the door slowly creaking open. That's when the scratching started in earnest. It was unmistakable now, a frantic scrabbling that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the closet, my mind racing through possibilities. A rat? A raccoon? How could an animal have gotten in there? I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. Part of me wanted to run, to bolt from the room and not look back. But a larger part, the part that had always been too curious for my own good, propelled me forward. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The scratching intensified, as if whatever was in there knew I was close. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and yanked the door open. For a moment, all I saw were my clothes, hanging neatly in a row. Then my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and when I saw it, a figure, crouched in the corner of my closet, partially hidden behind a curtain of dresses. I stumbled backward, a scream rising in my throat. But before I could make a sound, the figure moved. It was fast, inhumanly fast. 1 second it was in the closet, the next it was right in front of me. A hand clamped over my mouth, muffling my belated scream. I found myself staring into a pair of wild, desperate eyes. "Please," the figure whispered, and I realized with a jolt that it was a girl. Young, probably no older than me. "Please, you have to help me. They're coming." I wrenched her hand away from my mouth, backing up until I hit my desk. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "How did you get in my closet?" She glanced nervously at the window, then back at me. "There's no time to explain. They'll be here any minute. You have to hide me." "Hide you? From who? What's going on?" The questions tumbled out of me, my mind struggling to process the situation. The girl opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a sound cut through the night. A howl, long and mournful, but with an undercurrent of something predatory, something hungry. The color drained from the girl's face. "They're here," she whispered. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, movement caught my eye. Shadows moving across the quad with unnatural speed. They were heading straight for my dorm. "What are they?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The girl joined me at the window, her body tense. "Hunters," she said. "They're after me, and they won't stop until they find me." I turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time. She was pale, almost translucent in the dim light of my desk lamp. Her clothes were tattered and dirty, like she'd been running for a long time. But it was her eyes that caught me. They were old eyes, filled with a weariness that seemed at odds with her youthful face. "Why are they after you?" I asked, even as another part of my brain screamed at me to stop asking questions and start running. She met my gaze, and in that moment, I saw something flicker behind her eyes, something inhuman. "Because of what I am," she said softly, "because of what I can do." As if to demonstrate, she held out her hand. Before my disbelieving eyes, a small flame appeared in her palm, dancing and flickering with a life of its own. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in real life. They happened in books, in movies, not in a college dorm room on a Tuesday night. Another howl split the air, closer this time. The girl extinguished the flame, her eyes pleading. "Please," she said. "I know this is crazy. I know you have no reason to trust me. But if they find me, they'll kill me, and anyone who gets in their way." I looked back out the window. The shadows were at the entrance to my dorm now. In a matter of minutes, they'd be here. I made a decision then, one that would change the course of my life forever. "Okay," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I'll help you. What do we do?" Relief flooded her face. "Thank you," she breathed. Then, "All business. We need to get out of here. Is there a back way out of the building?" I nodded. "Fire escape. But we're on the 3rd floor." "That's fine. I can get us down safely." She held out her hand to me. "Do you trust me?" I hesitated for a moment, then took her hand. It was warm, almost hot to the touch. "I must be insane," I muttered. She gave me a grim smile. "Probably, but insane is better than dead." We moved quickly, grabbing my backpack and shoving a few essentials into it. As we were about to leave, I hesitated, looking back at my desk. My textbook lay open, notes scattered around it. It seemed surreal, this remnant of my normal life juxtaposed against the madness of the current situation. "We have to go," the girl urged, tugging at my hand. I nodded, tearing my eyes away from the desk. As we slipped out into the hallway, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. The hunters were inside. We ran down the hallway, our footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The fire escape was at the end of the hall, a red exit sign glowing like a beacon of hope. Just as we reached it, a door behind us burst open. I glanced back and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing in the doorway was only vaguely human-shaped, its body rippling and shifting as if it couldn't decide on a single form. "Run!" the girl yelled, pushing me through the fire exit. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face as we emerged onto the fire escape. Without hesitation, the girl vaulted over the railing, pulling me with her. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat as we fell. Then, impossibly, our descent slowed. It was as if we were floating, gently carried by an unseen force. We touched down softly on the grass below. Above us, I could hear snarls and the sound of metal tearing as the hunters reached the fire escape. "Come on," the girl said, already running. "We need to get to the woods. I can lose them there." I followed her, my legs moving almost of their own accord. As we ran across the open expanse of the quad, I heard a thud behind us. The hunters had jumped down, foregoing the fire escape entirely. We reached the tree line just as another howl pierced the night. I risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The hunters were gaining on us, their forms shifting and changing as they ran. One moment they were wolf-like, the next more bear than man. The girl led me deeper into the woods, weaving between trees with a surety that spoke of long practice. I stumbled along behind her, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. "Where are we going?" I gasped out between breaths. "There's a place," she panted back. "A safe place. If we can reach it, they can't follow." I wanted to ask more questions, but I needed all my breath for running. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as we delved deeper into the forest, but I knew better than to think we'd lost them. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into a small clearing. In the center stood a ring of stones, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The girl pulled me towards the stone circle. "Quick," she said. "Step inside." I hesitated at the edge of the circle, suddenly unsure. This was madness, magic, monsters, mysterious glowing stones. None of this could be real. A howl, alarmingly close, made the decision for me. I stepped into the circle. The effect was immediate. A warmth spread through me, and the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant howls, faded away. It was as if we were in a bubble, separate from the rest of the world. The girl let out a sigh of relief, sinking to her knees. "We're safe," she said. "For now." I looked at her, this strange girl who had turned my world upside down in the span of an hour. "Who are you?" I asked. "Really?" She met my gaze, a small, sad smile on her face. "My name is Lily," she said, "and I'm about to tell you a story that will change everything you thought you knew about the world." As she began to speak, I settled in to listen, knowing that my life would never be the same again. The midterm I'd been so worried about earlier seemed trivial now, a relic of a simpler time. Whatever came next, whatever this new reality held, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be normal again. And strangely enough, I was okay with that. The forest had seemed so inviting in the daylight. Now, as darkness fell and the trees loomed like silent sentinels, I realized how foolish I'd been. I was lost, alone, and the eerie sounds echoing through the woods told me I wasn't the only thing awake in this wilderness. My name's Alex, and I've always considered myself an experienced hiker. I'd tackled challenging trails before, prided myself on my navigation skills, but as I stood there, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of trees, I felt like a complete novice. The day had started out perfectly: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and a new trail I'd been itching to explore. I'd packed light, just some water, energy bars, and my trusty compass. I'd told myself I'd be back before sunset, no problem. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. Maybe it was when I decided to go off trail to check out that interesting rock formation, or when I'd stopped to watch a deer and its fawn, losing track of time. Whatever the reason, by the time I realized I was off course, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I pulled out my compass, squinting at it in the fading light. But in my panic, the directions seemed to blur together. North, south, it all looked the same in this green maze. "Okay, Alex," I muttered to myself, trying to keep calm. "You've been in tough spots before. Just think it through." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I knew I'd been heading east when I started, so if I just turned around and went west, I should eventually hit the trail again, right? With renewed determination, I set off in what I hoped was the right direction. But as I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, making me jump at every rustle of leaves. The light was almost gone now. The forest floor plunged into an eerie twilight. I fumbled in my pack for my flashlight, cursing under my breath when I couldn't find it. Had I really been stupid enough to leave it behind? A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I whirled around, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. If there was something out there, I just announced my presence. Silence answered me, but it was a loaded silence, full of potential energy. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about direction, I just needed to get out, to find some sign of civilization. But the faster I walked, the more turned around I became. Trees I could have sworn I'd passed before loomed out of the darkness. Was I going in circles? A low growl froze me in my tracks. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. Too deep, too wrong. I held my breath, straining my ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Panic surged through me, and I ran. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. But I didn't slow down. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with every second. I burst into a small clearing, the sudden moonlight momentarily blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing on the other side of the clearing. Relief flooded through me. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I realized something was off. It was too tall, too still, and its proportions were wrong. I skidded to a stop, my relief turning to ice in my veins. This wasn't a person. I didn't know what it was, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. Before I could move, the thing's head snapped towards me. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting an unnatural green, a mouth full of too many teeth. I turned and ran back into the trees, no longer caring about direction or finding my way out. My only thought was to get away from that thing in the clearing. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I couldn't run anymore, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The forest was silent again, but it was a tense silence, full of watchful anticipation. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart, I became aware of a soft glow coming from my right. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I focused on it, the glow grew stronger. Curiosity overcame fear, and I found myself moving towards the light. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a small cave, half hidden by thick underbrush. I hesitated at the entrance. Every horror movie I'd ever seen was screaming at me not to go in, but the alternative was staying out here in the dark with whatever that thing in the clearing had been. Taking a deep breath, I ducked into the cave. The source of the glow became apparent immediately. Strange, luminescent fungi covered the walls, casting a soft, blue-green light throughout the small space. But it wasn't the fungi that caught my attention. In the center of the cave stood a stone pedestal, and on top of it sat an ancient-looking book. I approached cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me, but nothing happened. The book just sat there, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Against my better judgment, I reached out and opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, none of which made any sense to me. But as I flipped through, a loose page fell out. I picked it up, squinting at the faded handwriting. It was in English, unlike the rest of the book. As I read, my eyes widened. It was a warning, a description of creatures that lived in these woods, ancient beings that had been here long before humans. Beings that didn't take kindly to trespassers. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the thing in the clearing. Was that what the note was talking about? The next part of the note described a ritual, a way to appease these creatures and ensure safe passage through their domain. It seemed absurd, like something out of a fantasy novel. But after what I'd seen tonight, I was willing to believe just about anything. I memorized the ritual as best I could, then tucked the note into my pocket. As I turned to leave the cave, a growl from outside made me freeze. It was back, and it had found me. I could see its silhouette at the cave entrance, blocking out the moonlight. Those eerie green eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on me. With shaking hands, I began the ritual. I didn't have the items the note mentioned, but I hoped intent would be enough. I spoke the words phonetically, not understanding their meaning, but putting every ounce of desperation I had into them. As I finished the last word, the creature lunged. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. but it never came. I opened my eyes to find the cave empty. The creature was gone, as if it had never been there. Even its silhouette at the entrance had vanished. For a long moment, I just stood there, hardly daring to breathe. Had it worked? Or was this just the calm before the storm? Gathering my courage, I stepped out of the cave. The forest was different. The oppressive darkness had lifted, and I could see a faint path leading away from the cave, softly illuminated by moonlight. I followed the path, my heart in my throat. Every shadow still seemed to hide potential dangers, but the bone-deep terror I'd felt earlier had faded. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard a sound that made me want to cry with relief. Cars. I'd reached the road. As I broke through the tree line and saw the asphalt gleaming in the moonlight, I finally allowed myself to believe I was safe. I flagged down the first car I saw, probably looking like a madman with my torn clothes and wild eyes. The elderly couple in the car were skeptical at first, but something in my face must have convinced them I was genuinely in distress. They gave me a ride back to town, peppering me with questions I couldn't answer. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? As we drove away from the forest, I looked back. For a moment, I thought I saw those green eyes watching from between the trees. But then we turned a corner and the forest was lost from view. I never went hiking alone again after that night, and I never returned to those woods. But sometimes, when the night is dark and the wind whispers through the trees, I remember the terror, the strange cave, the ritual, and I wonder if it was all real, or just a nightmare born from fear and exhaustion. But then I feel the weight of that note in my pocket, the note I couldn't bring myself to get rid of. And I know the forest has secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered. The scream that tore through the night was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't just the volume or the suddenness that chilled me to the bone. It was the recognition. That was my daughter's voice, and she was no longer in her sleeping bag beside me. I'm Jack, and what started as a fun family camping trip turned into every parent's worst nightmare in the blink of an eye. My wife Sarah and I had brought our kids, Emma, 8, and Liam, 6, to Whispering Pines Campground for a long weekend of outdoor adventure. We'd spent the day hiking, fishing, and roasting marshmallows around the campfire. It was picture perfect until it wasn't. The scream jolted me awake from a deep sleep. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The beam of light revealed Sarah already unzipping the tent, her face a mask of panic. "Emma?" I called out, my voice hoarse with sleep and fear. "Emma, where are you?" There was no answer, just the eerie silence of the forest at night. I scrambled out of the tent after Sarah, nearly tripping over Liam, who was starting to stir, awakened by the commotion. "Stay in the tent, buddy," I told him, trying to keep my voice calm. "We'll be right back." Outside, the campsite was bathed in silvery moonlight. Everything looked normal at first glance. The smoldering remains of our campfire, our cooler, the kids' bikes propped against a tree. But Emma's sleeping bag, which we'd let her place just outside the tent because she wanted to sleep under the stars, was empty. Sarah was already at the edge of our campsite, shining her flashlight into the woods. "Emma!" she called, her voice cracking. "Emma, answer us." I joined her, my own flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches casting strange, shifting shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. "We need to split up," I said, trying to think logically through the haze of panic. "You go that way, I'll go this way. Yell if you find anything." Sarah nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. As she headed off in one direction, I plunged into the woods in the other, calling Emma's name every few steps. The forest seemed to swallow my voice, the darkness pressing in around me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had she sleepwalked into the woods? Had some animal dragged her off? Or was it something worse? I don't know how long I searched. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes feeling like hours. My throat was raw from shouting, my legs aching from running through the uneven terrain. But I couldn't stop. My little girl was out there somewhere, alone and scared. Suddenly, I heard Sarah's voice in the distance. "Jack, Jack, come quick!" I sprinted towards her voice, branches whipping at my face. I burst into a small clearing to find Sarah kneeling on the ground, holding something in her hands. As I got closer, I realized what it was. Emma's favorite stuffed animal, a worn rabbit she'd had since she was a baby. "She wouldn't have gone anywhere without this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Jack, what's happening?" I knelt beside her, taking the stuffed rabbit. It was dirty and slightly damp, as if it had been lying on the forest floor for a while. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. Emma hadn't just wandered off, something had taken her. As if in response to this thought, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. Sarah and I both whirled around, our flashlights scanning the tree line. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the light of our flashlights, too high off the ground to be any normal forest animal. As I watched, transfixed with horror, more pairs of eyes appeared. They were surrounding us. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "Jack," she whispered, "what are those things?" Before I could answer, one of the creatures stepped into the clearing. In the dim light, I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, but there was nothing human about its movements. It was too fluid, too wrong. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground. These things had my daughter, I was sure of it, and I wasn't leaving without her. "Where's my daughter?" I demanded, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. The creature tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. Then, it spoke. Its voice was like rustling leaves and creaking branches, barely recognizable as speech. "The young one," it said, "is safe. For now." Sarah let out a choked sob beside me. I squeezed her hand, trying to draw strength from her presence. "What do you want?" I asked. "Why did you take her?" The creature moved closer, its fellows remaining at the edge of the clearing. As it approached, I could see it more clearly. Its skin was like tree bark, its limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. Its face was a nightmare of knots and whorls, with those reflective eyes set deep in hollow sockets. "We are the guardians of this forest," it said. "For centuries, we have protected these woods from those who would harm them. Your kind has forgotten the old ways, the respect due to the wild places." I swallowed hard, trying to process what I was hearing. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, a dream brought on by panic and exhaustion, but the weight of Emma's stuffed rabbit in my hand was all too real. "We didn't mean any disrespect," I said carefully. "We're just a family on a camping trip. Please, we just want our daughter back." The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Intent matters not. The forest demands balance. A life for the lives your kind has taken." My blood ran cold as I realized what it was saying. They wanted to keep Emma, to... what? Sacrifice her. The thought was too horrible to contemplate. "No," I said, surprised by the fierceness in my voice. "You can't have her. Take me instead." Sarah gasped beside me, but I pressed on. "I'm the father. I'm responsible for bringing her here. If someone has to pay the price, it should be me." The creature regarded me silently for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, it nodded. "Your offer is accepted," it said. "The young one will be returned, but you must come with us." Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by fear. I turned to Sarah. seeing the terror and anguish in her eyes. "I have to do this," I told her softly. "Get Emma and Liam out of here. Don't come back." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Jack, no. There has to be another way." But we both knew there wasn't. I pulled her close, kissing her fiercely. "I love you," I whispered. "Tell the kids I love them too." Then, before I could lose my nerve, I turned back to the creature. "I'm ready," I said, as if on cue. Emma stumbled out of the woods on the other side of the clearing. Sarah ran to her, scooping her up in her arms. Emma looked dazed but unhurt. I allowed myself one last look at my family. Sarah met my eyes over Emma's head, her gaze full of love and sorrow. Then, the creatures moved in around me, their bark-like bodies pressing close. As they led me into the depths of the forest, I heard Sarah's voice fading behind me, explaining to a confused Emma that Daddy had to go away for a while. My heart ached, but I knew I'd made the right choice. The forest swallowed us up, the darkness growing deeper with each step. I didn't know what awaited me, what price I would have to pay. But as long as my family was safe, I was ready to face whatever came next. As we walked, the creature that had spoken to me moved closer. "Few would make such a sacrifice," it said, its voice like wind through dry leaves. "Perhaps there is hope for your kind yet." I didn't respond. What could I say? That I was terrified. That I already missed my family with an ache that felt physical. That I was angry at the unfairness of it all. Instead, I walked on in silence, leaving behind the world I knew and stepping into a realm of ancient magic and forgotten bargains. The forest had demanded a price, and I had paid it. Whatever came next, I would face it knowing my children were safe. And as the last echoes of the human world faded behind me, I realized that this was more than just a father's sacrifice. It was the beginning of something new, a bridge between two worlds that had long been separated. Maybe, just maybe, there was a greater purpose to all of this. And with that thought to sustain me, I walked on into the heart of the whispering pines. The silver photo frame on my nightstand was turned face down when I woke up. I distinctly remembered leaving it upright the night before, smiling at the family portrait it held. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this wasn't the first time I'd noticed things out of place lately. I'm Claire, a 34-year-old marketing executive who recently moved into a spacious suburban home. After years of cramped city living, I was thrilled to have more space. But with a demanding job and a house too big for one person to manage, I decided to hire a housekeeper. Enter Mrs. Phillips, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with impeccable references. She seemed perfect, efficient, thorough, and available to work the hours I needed. I thought I'd struck gold. The first few weeks were great. I'd come home to a spotless house, laundry done, and sometimes even a meal prepped in the fridge. Mrs. Phillips was a godsend, allowing me to focus on my work without drowning in household chores. But then, little things started to feel off. It began with small inconsistencies. A book on the coffee table that I didn't remember leaving there. The order of my shoes in the closet slightly rearranged. My favorite mug in a different cabinet. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe I was more forgetful than I realized. The stress of my job was getting to me, surely. But as the occurrences became more frequent and noticeable, a nagging sense of unease began to grow. One evening, I came home to find my laptop open on the kitchen counter. I always kept it in my study, and I certainly hadn't left it running. When I checked the browser history, I found searches for my name, my family members, and my company. My heart raced as I confronted Mrs. Phillips the next day. Her reaction was oddly calm, almost rehearsed. She apologized profusely, claiming she'd only used the laptop to look up a cleaning technique and must have accidentally clicked on some pop-ups. Her explanation seemed plausible, but something in her eyes made me uneasy. I decided to be more vigilant. I started taking photos of rooms before leaving for work, comparing them to how I found them when I returned. The changes were subtle but undeniable. A pillow slightly out of place, a drawer not fully closed, my clothes arranged in a different order than I'd left them. The final straw came when I noticed my personal documents had been rifled through. The folder I kept in my desk drawer was ever so slightly out of alignment. When I opened it, I could tell someone had been looking at my financial statements and insurance policies. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow, seemed ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me. In the morning, bleary-eyed and on edge, I made a decision. I needed to know what was really going on when I wasn't home. I called in sick to work and set up a small camera in the living room, hidden among my books. Then I pretended to leave for the day, driving around the block and parking where I could see my house. My heart pounded as I watched Mrs. Phillips arrive and let herself in. Hours crawled by as I sat in my car, alternating between watching the house and checking the camera feed on my phone. At first, everything seemed normal. Mrs. Phillips cleaned, did laundry, and went about her usual tasks. But then, around midday, her behavior changed. She began moving through the house with purpose, opening drawers and cabinets, clearly searching for something. I watched in horror as she entered my bedroom and headed straight for my closet. She emerged with a small box I kept hidden in the back, a box containing old family heirlooms and personal mementos. My breath caught in my throat as she opened it, carefully examining each item inside. I couldn't take it anymore. I burst out of my car and ran to the house, fumbling with my keys in my haste to get inside. "Mrs. Phillips," I called out as I entered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I forgot some papers I need for a meeting. I just came to grab them quickly." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of hurried footsteps. Mrs. Phillips appeared at the top of the stairs, her usually impassive face showing a flicker of surprise before smoothing over. "Oh, Miss Claire," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. I was just finishing up in your room." I forced a smile, my mind racing. "No problem at all. I'll just grab what I need and be out of your way." As I climbed the stairs, I could feel Mrs. Phillips watching me intently. My skin crawled, but I maintained my composure as I entered my bedroom. The box was back in the closet, but slightly out of place. My hands shook as I pretended to look for papers in my desk. "Mrs. Phillips," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "have you seen a blue folder anywhere? I could have sworn I left it on my desk." "No, I'm afraid not," she replied, hovering in the doorway. "But I'd be happy to help you look." "That's all right," I said quickly. "I probably left it at the office. I should get going anyway." I made a show of checking my watch and hurrying out, all too aware of Mrs. Phillips' eyes on me. As I drove away, my mind was in turmoil. What was she looking for? Why was she so interested in my personal belongings? That night, I couldn't sleep. I pored over the camera footage, watching Mrs. Phillips methodically search my house. She seemed to be looking for something specific, but what? The next morning, I called Mrs. Phillips and told her I wouldn't need her services that day. Then I began my own search of the house, looking for anything out of place, any clue to what she might be after. In my study, I found a small slip of paper tucked into a book. It had a series of numbers written on it, a phone number I didn't recognize. With shaking hands, I dialed it. A gruff male voice answered. "Yeah? Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause. Then, "Who's asking?" I hung up, my heart racing. What had I stumbled into? Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own home. I discovered more hidden notes, overheard Mrs. Phillips having hushed phone conversations when she thought I wasn't around, and once, I could have sworn I saw her taking photos of my mail. I was living on edge, jumping at every sound, double-checking every lock. I knew I should go to the police, but what would I tell them? That my housekeeper was too thorough, that I had a hunch she was up to something nefarious. It all came to a head one night when I woke to the sound of my study door creaking open. I lay frozen in bed, listening to soft footsteps moving around downstairs. Mrs. Phillips had a key for emergencies, but this was no emergency. Silently, I crept out of bed and down the stairs, my phone clutched in my hand, 911 already dialed and ready to call. As I approached the study, I could see a sliver of light under the door. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Mrs. Phillips stood at my desk, a flashlight in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. She looked up, her eyes widening in shock. "Mrs. Phillips," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I think it's time you told me what's really going on here." For a moment, she looked like she might try to deny everything. Then her shoulders sagged, and she sank into my desk chair. "I suppose there's no point in hiding it anymore," she said, her voice tired. "I'm not really a housekeeper, Miss Claire. I'm a private investigator." My mind reeled. A private investigator? But why? Who hired you? Mrs. Phillips, if that was even her real name, sighed. "Your father hired me. He's been trying to find you for years." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My father? But he's dead. He died when I was a child. She shook her head. "That's what your mother told you, but he's very much alive, and he's been searching for you ever since your mother took you and disappeared." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I processed this information. Memories I'd long suppressed came flooding back. Arguments between my parents, hushed phone calls, the sudden move in the middle of the night when I was 10. "Why?" I managed to ask. Why didn't he find us sooner?" "Your mother was very thorough in covering your tracks," Mrs. Phillips explained. "It's taken years of investigation to finally track you down. Your father, he just wants a chance to explain, to make things right." I sank to the floor, my legs no longer able to support me. My entire life, everything I thought I knew about my family, had been a lie. As the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow through the study windows, I made a decision. I looked up at Mrs. Phillips, this woman who had invaded my privacy but who had also, in a twisted way, brought the truth to light. "I want to meet him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Phillips nodded, a small smile on her face. "He'll be so happy to hear that. He's never stopped loving you, you know." As she took out her phone to make the call, I sat there on the floor of my study, watching the dawn of a new day and the dawn of a new chapter in my life. The truth had been hiding in my home all along, disguised as a housekeeper with a feather duster and a secret agenda. I didn't know what the future held, what explanations or revelations awaited me, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The moment I saw his thumb jutting out from the shadows, I knew I should have kept driving. But loneliness and fatigue are a dangerous combination, especially on a road that seems to stretch endlessly into the night. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating a figure that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. My name's Jake, and I'm a long-haul trucker, 18 years on the road, and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for that night on Route 66. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing to make a deadline. The radio had long since devolved into static, and my thermos of coffee was running on fumes, just like me. The monotony of the highway was starting to play tricks on my eyes, making the yellow lines dance and waver. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. In the split second it took me to pass him, our eyes met in my side mirror. There was something in that gaze that made my skin crawl, but exhaustion overrode my better judgment. I hit the brakes, the big rig groaning as it slowed to a stop. I watched in my mirror as the hitchhiker approached. He moved with an odd, jerky gait, like a marionette with tangled strings. As he got closer, I could make out more details. He was tall and rail-thin, wearing a threadbare jacket despite the warm night. His face was gaunt, all sharp angles and deep shadows. "Where you headed?" I called out as he reached the passenger door. His voice, when he answered, was like gravel being crushed. "Wherever you're going." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to put the truck in gear and get the hell out of there. But some misplaced sense of decency made me reach over and unlock the door instead. He clambered in, movements still jerky and uncoordinated. Up close, he smelled like damp earth and something metallic I couldn't quite place. I tried not to breathe too deeply as I pulled back onto the highway. "Name's Jake," I said, more to break the uncomfortable silence than out of any real desire to chat. He turned those unsettling eyes on me. "John," he replied after a beat too long. "John Smith." "Right. And I'm Santa Claus." But I didn't push it. Rule number 1 of picking up hitchhikers: don't ask too many questions. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of tires on asphalt and the occasional ping of bugs hitting the windshield. I kept sneaking glances at my passenger. Something about him just felt off. His stillness was unnatural, like he wasn't quite comfortable in his own skin. "So, where you coming from, John?" I asked, unable to stand the silence any longer. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had a dreamy, far-off quality to it. "A place where the sun never sets and the streets are paved with bones." I chuckled nervously, trying to play it off as a joke. "Sounds like Vegas." John didn't laugh. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes. "You have no idea," he murmured. The cab of the truck suddenly felt very small and very cold. I cranked up the heat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. John had turned his attention to the window, watching the darkness rush by. As the miles ticked away, my unease grew. John's presence seemed to suck all the warmth and light out of the world. The familiar highway felt alien and menacing, shadows deepening at the edges of my headlights. I was about to suggest we stop at the next rest area when John spoke again. "Do you believe in monsters, Jake?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "Can't say I do," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. John turned those dead eyes on me again. "You will." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Look, buddy, I don't know what your deal is, but..." I never got to finish that sentence. Because at that moment, John began to change. It started with his skin. It seemed to ripple and shift, like something was moving underneath. Then his face began to elongate, features melting and reforming into something inhuman. I watched in horror as his fingers lengthened into claws, tearing through the worn fabric of his gloves. I slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing as it came to a stop in the middle of the highway. I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to get away from whatever was happening beside me. But John, or the thing that had been John, was faster. A clawed hand shot out, grabbing my arm with inhuman strength. I yelled in pain and fear, struggling to break free. "Don't leave now, Jake," the creature growled, its voice a hellish distortion of John's gravelly tones. "The fun's just beginning." I lashed out blindly, my fist connecting with something that felt like cold putty. The thing that was John howled, a sound that made my blood run cold. Its grip loosened just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I threw myself out of the truck, hitting the asphalt hard. Pain shot through my shoulder, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The sound of tearing metal filled the air, followed by an inhuman roar. Against my better judgment, I glanced over my shoulder. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The creature had torn through the roof of the cab like it was tissue paper. It towered over the truck, a nightmarish amalgamation of man and beast. Its skin was a patchwork of scales and fur, its face a twisted mask of fangs and glowing eyes. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning as I sprinted down the highway, but I could hear it behind me, its heavy footfall shaking the ground. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw lights in the distance, a gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, praying I could reach it before the creature caught up. The sound of pursuit suddenly stopped. I risked another look back and saw the creature retreating, shrinking back into a more human form as it disappeared into the shadows at the side of the road. I stumbled into the gas station parking lot, gasping for breath. The attendant looked up from his magazine, eyes widening at my disheveled appearance. "You okay, man?" he asked, already reaching for the phone. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, collapsing onto the cracked linoleum floor. As the attendant called the police, I stared out at the highway, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. The cops arrived quickly, lights flashing and sirens wailing. They found my truck abandoned on the highway, the cab torn open like a sardine can. There was no sign of John or the creature he'd become. They didn't believe my story, of course. Who would? They chalked it up to exhaustion and possible dehydration, maybe even a hallucination brought on by some bad truck stop food, but they couldn't explain the claw marks on my arm or the inhuman prints they found around my truck. I quit trucking after that night. Couldn't bring myself to get back behind the wheel, to face those long, dark stretches of highway. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those glowing eyes and that distorted voice fresh in my mind. I don't know what John was or where he came from, but I do know this. There are things out there in the darkness, things that defy explanation, and sometimes they hitch a ride. So if you're ever driving down a lonely stretch of highway and you see a solitary figure with his thumb out, just keep driving, because you never know who or what you might be letting into your life. As for me, I'll stick to the daylight from now on, and I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live. Some rides just aren't worth the risk. The moment I locked eyes with him in the rearview mirror, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary night bus ride. His gaze, hidden beneath a dark hood, seemed to bore right through me, igniting a primal fear I couldn't shake. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would push me to the very edge of sanity. My name's Mia, and I'm a grad student at the local university. That night, I was heading back to campus after visiting my parents for the weekend. It was a 4-hour trip, and I'd opted for the cheaper night bus to save some cash. Big mistake. The bus was nearly empty when I boarded, just a couple of other passengers scattered about. I chose a seat near the middle, settling in for what I hoped would be an uneventful ride. As we pulled out of the station, I noticed him for the first time, a figure in a dark hoodie, sitting at the very back of the bus. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another passenger, right? But as the miles ticked by and the other riders gradually disembarked at various stops, I became acutely aware that it was just me, the driver, and the hooded figure left on the bus. That's when I felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But every time I glanced in the rearview mirror above the driver's seat, I saw those eyes staring back at me. I couldn't make out his face clearly in the dim light of the bus, but there was something unsettling about the intensity of his gaze. It never wavered, never blinked, just 2 pinpoints of light in the darkness, fixed on me. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but all I could see was my own reflection and the endless darkness beyond. The soft hum of the engine and the occasional bump in the road were the only sounds breaking the eerie silence. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to move seats, hoping to break the line of sight between me and my unwanted observer. I gathered my things and moved to a seat closer to the front, pointedly avoiding looking towards the back of the bus. For a few blissful moments I felt relief, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The hooded figure had changed seats too, maintaining the same distance between us. My heart began to race. This couldn't be a coincidence. I considered asking the driver to stop, to let me off early, but we were in the middle of nowhere. The thought of being stranded on a dark, deserted road seemed even worse than staying on the bus. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call someone, anyone. But of course, there was no signal. We were passing through a dead zone, cut off from the rest of the world. The next hour was the longest of my life. I sat rigid in my seat, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound of movement from behind me. A few times I thought I heard soft footsteps, but when I whipped my head around to look, the hooded figure was always in the same spot, those unblinking eyes fixed on me. As we approached the outskirts of the city, I began to relax slightly. We were almost there, just a little longer, and I'd be safe. That's when it happened. The bus lurched suddenly, the engine sputtering and dying. We rolled to a stop on the side of the road, the interior lights flickering ominously before going out completely. "Sorry, folks," the driver called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Looks like we've got some engine trouble. Sit tight while I take a look." I wanted to scream at him not to leave, to tell him about the creepy passenger in the back, but my voice seemed stuck in my throat. I watched helplessly as he exited the bus, leaving me alone with him. In the darkness, I could no longer see the hooded figure in the mirror, but I could feel his presence, oppressive and menacing. The silence stretched on, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Then, I heard it. Soft footsteps, moving slowly up the aisle of the bus. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I bolted from my seat, stumbling towards the front of the bus. My hands shook as I wrestled with the door, finally managing to push it open. I tumbled out onto the road, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The driver was nowhere to be seen. Had it been minutes since he left, or hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. I started running, my feet pounding against the asphalt. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Behind me, I heard the bus door open again. He was coming after me. My lungs burned as I ran, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. But no matter how fast I went, I could hear him behind me, his footsteps steady and relentless. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw lights ahead. A gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon of hope in the darkness. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted towards it. I burst through the door, startling the sleepy-looking attendant behind the counter. "Please," I gasped. "You have to help me. There's someone after me." The attendant's eyes widened as he took in my disheveled appearance. He reached for the phone, already dialing as he asked, "What happened? Who's after you?" But as I turned to point out the window, to show him my pursuer, I realized something that made my blood run cold. There was no one there. The road was empty, stretching out into the darkness in both directions. The police arrived a short while later, their questions only adding to my confusion and fear. They found no sign of the hooded figure, no evidence of anyone following me. The bus was where we'd left it, the driver working on the engine, completely unaware of what had transpired. As the adrenaline wore off, doubt began to creep in. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that the stress of grad school and lack of sleep had caused me to hallucinate? But even as I tried to rationalize what had happened, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that unwavering gaze that had followed me through the night. Real or not, the fear had been genuine. The police offered to drive me back to campus, an offer I gratefully accepted. As we drove away from the gas station, I couldn't help but look back one last time. And there, just for a moment, I thought I saw a hooded figure standing at the edge of the light, watching me go. I never took the night bus again after that. The incident left me jumpy and paranoid for weeks, jumping at shadows and avoiding being alone in public spaces. My friends and family were concerned, suggesting therapy or medication to help with what they saw as an anxiety disorder. But I knew what I had experienced, even if I couldn't explain it. There are things out there in the darkness, things that defy rational explanation, and sometimes they ride the night bus, waiting for unsuspecting passengers. To this day, I can't see a hooded figure without my heart rate spiking. I avoid traveling alone at night whenever possible, and every now and then, When I'm in a crowded place, I get that familiar prickling sensation at the back of my neck. When I turn to look, there's never anyone there. But I know, deep down, that somewhere out there, those eyes are still watching, waiting for our paths to cross again. So if you ever find yourself on a nearly empty bus late at night, and you feel like you're being watched, trust your instincts. Because sometimes, the monsters we fear aren't just in our imagination. Sometimes, they're sitting right behind us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As for me, I'll stick to daylight travel from now on. Some journeys just aren't worth the risk, because you never know who, or what, might be sharing your ride. The moment I saw the glint in the innkeeper's eye, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. What was supposed to be a romantic getaway had suddenly become a fight for survival, and the quaint bed and breakfast we'd stumbled upon was anything but the cozy haven it appeared to be. I'm Emily, and my boyfriend Tom and I had been planning this trip for months. Both of us were swamped with work, me with my law firm, and Tom with his startup, and we desperately needed some time away from the city. When Tom found this charming little BB online, tucked away in the countryside, it seemed perfect, picturesque, isolated, and run by a sweet elderly couple. At least, that's what we thought. The drive out was beautiful, all winding country roads and rolling hills. As the GPS signal got weaker, I felt the stress of the city melting away. Tom reached over and squeezed my hand, a smile on his face that I hadn't seen in weeks. "Almost there," he said, as we turned onto a narrow dirt road. "Can you believe this place? It's like something out of a fairy tale." I had to agree. The old Victorian house that came into view was stunning, with its wraparound porch and gingerbread trim. Flower boxes overflowed with colorful blooms, and a neat gravel path led up to the front door. It was almost too perfect. As we pulled up, the front door opened, and out stepped our hosts. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins were the picture of small-town charm, he in a cardigan and bow tie, she in a floral dress with an apron. They waved enthusiastically as we got out of the car. "Welcome, welcome," Mrs. Wilkins called out, her voice syrupy sweet. "We're so glad you made it safely. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from your journey." Mr. Wilkins insisted on carrying our bags, despite Tom's protests. As we followed them inside, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was off. Their smiles were a little too wide, their hospitality a touch too eager. The interior of the BB was just as charming as the outside, filled with antique furniture and quirky knickknacks. But there was something about it that felt staged, like a movie set, rather than a real home. "Your room is just up these stairs," Mrs. Wilkins said, leading the way. "It's our best room, perfect for a young couple like yourselves." The room was beautiful, with a four-poster bed and a view of the surrounding countryside. But as Mrs. Wilkins fussed over the curtains and Mr. Wilkins set down our bags, I noticed them exchanging a look. It was quick, barely a flicker, but in that moment, I saw something cold and calculating in their eyes. "Dinner will be served at 7, Mrs. Wilkins announced, her cheerful demeanor back in place. "We do hope you'll join us. I've prepared something special." As soon as they left, Tom flopped onto the bed with a contented sigh. "This place is amazing, Em. You were worried for nothing." I tried to smile, but it felt forced. "Yeah, it's great. I'm just tired, I guess." We freshened up and headed down for dinner. The dining room was cozy, with a crackling fireplace and a table set for 4. The Wilkins were already seated, beaming at us as we entered. "There you are," Mr. Wilkins boomed. "Sit, sit. Martha's outdone herself with the cooking tonight." The food was delicious, I had to admit, but as we ate, I couldn't help but notice how intently the Wilkins watched us. They asked questions about our lives, our jobs, our families. Nothing unusual for BB hosts, but there was an underlying intensity to their curiosity that set me on edge. "More wine, dear?" Mrs. Wilkins asked. already refilling my glass before I could respond. I took a sip to be polite, but my head was already feeling fuzzy. Tom, on the other hand, was on his third glass and growing increasingly animated. "This is incredible," he slurred slightly. "You guys, you're just the best. Aren't they the best, Em?" I nodded, trying to catch his eye, to somehow communicate that we needed to be cautious, but he was oblivious, caught up in the Wilkins and charm offensive. As the evening wore on, my unease grew. The Wilkins' smiles never wavered, but their eyes seemed to grow colder, more predatory. I made excuses about being tired, practically dragging Tom away from the table. Back in our room, I tried to talk to Tom about my concerns, but he brushed them off. "You're being paranoid, Em," he said, his words slightly slurred. "They're just nice people. Relax, okay? That's why we're here." I wanted to argue, but exhaustion was creeping over me. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the stress of the city making me jumpy. I fell into a fitful sleep, plagued by strange dreams of being watched. A noise woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was part of my dream, but then I heard it again, a soft creak, like someone walking on old floorboards. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Tom," I whispered, shaking him. But he was out cold, snoring softly. The moonlight filtering through the curtains cast eerie shadows across the room. As my eyes adjusted, I could have sworn I saw the doorknob turning slowly. I held my breath, willing it to be my imagination. But then the door began to open, inch by agonizing inch. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness of the hallway. I wanted to scream, to wake Tom, to do something. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step into the room, and in that moment I recognized the outline of Mrs. Wilkins' on floral dress. She moved towards the bed with unnatural grace, something glinting in her hand. Was it a knife? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. Just as she reached the foot of the bed, I found my voice. "What are you doing?" I croaked out. Mrs. Wilkins froze, then slowly turned her head towards me. In the dim light, I could see her face, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. Her kindly expression was gone, replaced by something inhuman, hungry. "Oh dear," she said, her voice no longer sweet, but rasping and cold. "You weren't supposed to wake up." I screamed then, finally jolting Tom awake. He sat up, confused and groggy, as Mrs. Wilkins lunged towards us. What happened next was a blur of motion and terror. Tom, still half asleep, grappled with Mrs. Wilkins while I scrambled for my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. "Run, Em!" Tom yelled, struggling to hold Mrs. Wilkins back. "Get out of here!" I hesitated for a split second, torn between helping Tom and finding help. But then Mr. Wilkins appeared in the doorway, his kindly demeanor replaced by the same predatory look as his wife. I made a decision then, one that would haunt me. I ran, past Mr. Wilkins, down the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floors. I could hear Tom shouting, the sounds of a struggle, but I didn't look back. I burst out of the front door into the cool night air, gasping and sobbing. The gravel path cut into my feet as I ran towards our car, fumbling for the keys in my pajama pocket. Just as I reached the car, I heard the front door of the BB slam open. Mr. Wilkins stood on the porch, his face twisted into something barely human. "You can't leave," he called out, his voice a guttural growl. "No one ever leaves." With shaking hands, I managed to unlock the car and throw myself inside, locking the doors just as Mr. Wilkins reached it. He pounded on the window, his face pressed against the glass, eyes wild and hungry. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. For one heart-stopping moment, it just sputtered. Then, mercifully, it roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, nearly running over Mr. Wilkins as I peeled out of the driveway. As I sped down the dirt road, I could see the Wilkins in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. And in the upstairs window, I caught a glimpse of Tom's face, pale and terrified. I drove through the night, tears streaming down my face. The image of Tom at the window burned into my mind. I should have made him come with me. I should have done something, anything, to save him. When I finally reached a town and found a police station, they didn't believe me. They said I was hysterical, that I must have had a nightmare or a bad reaction to something I ate. When they went to check out the BB, they found nothing. No Victorian house, no Wilkins, no Tom, just an empty field where I swore the house had stood. It's been 2 years since that night, and I haven't stopped searching for answers. I've scoured the internet, hired private investigators, even tried to go back to where the BB was supposed to be, but it's like it never existed. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Mrs. Wilkins' voice rasping and cold, "You weren't supposed to wake up." And I wonder, did I ever really wake up at all? Or am I still trapped in that nightmarish BB, living out some twisted fantasy of escape? All I know is this. If you're ever driving down a lonely country road and come across a charming bed and breakfast that seems too good to be true, keep driving. Because some places aren't meant to be found and some hosts aren't what they seem. And if you're not careful, you might check in, but you'll never check out. The ancient symbols carved into the tree bark seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, drawing me deeper into the forest. As a park ranger, I'd walked these trails 1,000 times, but I'd never seen anything like this before. Little did I know, my discovery would plunge me into a world of ancient rituals and unspeakable horrors lurking in the heart of the wilderness. My name's Sarah, and I've been a ranger at Whispering Pines National Park for over a decade. I thought I knew every inch of these woods, every secret they held, but that day proved me horribly wrong. It started as a routine patrol. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under my boots as I made my way along the lesser-used trails. I loved this time of year, the vibrant colors, the smell of decaying leaves, the quiet that settled over the forest as it prepared for winter. I was about 2 hours into my hike when I first noticed something odd. A tree just off the trail, with strange markings on its trunk. At first, I thought it might be vandalism. We'd had issues with that before. But as I got closer, I realized these weren't the work of bored teenagers or overzealous hikers. The symbols were intricate, clearly carved with precision and care. They looked ancient, reminiscent of Norse runes or Celtic knots, but unlike anything I'd ever seen in my archaeological studies. And there was something else. A faint glow emanating from the grooves, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. I reached out to touch the carvings, my fingers trembling slightly. The moment my skin made contact, a jolt of energy shot through me, making me stumble back. The forest around me seemed to shift, the colors becoming more vivid, the sounds more intense. For a moment, I could have sworn I heard whispers on the wind, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Shaking off the strange sensation, I pulled out my camera to document the find. But when I tried to take a picture, the screen went fuzzy, refusing to focus on the symbols. It was as if they didn't want to be captured. I made a note of the location, intending to report it to the park archaeologist. But as I turned to continue my patrol, I noticed more symbols on a nearby tree. And another beyond that. They formed a trail, leading deeper into the forest, away from the marked paths. Every instinct told me to turn back, to call for backup before investigating further. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know where these symbols led, what they meant. As I followed the trail of marked trees, the forest around me began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sky. The air became heavy and thick, filled with an earthy, almost metallic scent. And all the while, those whispers continued, growing louder with each step. I lost track of how long I'd been walking when I stumbled into a clearing. What I saw there made me freeze in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of standing stones, each one at least 10 feet tall. They were covered in the same symbols I'd seen on the trees, but here they glowed brighter, their light pulsing in unison. The ground within the circle was bare. The grass and underbrush cleared away to reveal dark, rich soil. But it was what lay at the center of the stone circle that truly chilled me to the bone. A stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I hoped wasn't blood, and arranged around it, a collection of objects that looked like they belonged in a nightmare. Bones, feathers, strange crystals, and things I couldn't even begin to identify. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist, not in the real world, not in my forest. As I wrestled with my disbelief, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, to find myself face to face with an old man. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, his weathered face grave as he regarded me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raspy and low. "This place isn't for your kind." I opened my mouth to respond, to demand answers, but before I could speak, more figures emerged from the trees. They wore dark robes, their faces hidden in deep hoods. They moved with an unnatural grace, forming a loose circle around me and the old man. "What is this place?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. "Who are you people?" The old man's expression softened slightly. "We are the guardians," he said. "We protect the ancient ways, the old magic that still lingers in places like this." "Magic?" I repeated incredulously. "That's impossible." A humorless smile crossed the old man's face. "Many things are possible in this world, Ranger, more than you can imagine." As if to prove his point, he raised his hand. The symbols on the standing stones flared to life, their glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. The whispers I'd been hearing grew to a crescendo, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to tremble. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there, had to report what I'd found, but as I turned to run, I found my path blocked by the robed figures. They stood silent and motionless, an impenetrable wall between me and escape. "You have a choice to make," the old man said, his voice cutting through the cacophony of whispers. "You can join us, learn our ways, become part of something greater than yourself. Or—" He trailed off, but the threat was clear in his eyes. I glanced around wildly, looking for any way out, but I was surrounded, trapped in this impossible situation. "Why me?" I asked, stalling for time as I tried to think of a plan. "Why show me all this?" "You were chosen," one of the robed figures spoke, its voice ethereal and androgynous. "The forest led you here. It sees something in you." I shook my head, still struggling to accept what was happening. "This is insane. I'm a park ranger, not some chosen one. There has to be a mistake." The old man stepped closer, his eyes boring into mine. "There are no mistakes in matters like these. You have been brought here for a reason. The only question is, will you accept your destiny?" As he spoke, the energy in the clearing seemed to intensify. The glowing symbols pulsed faster, the whispers grew louder, and I could feel a strange pressure building in the air around us. It was as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting for my answer. I looked around at the robed figures, at the ancient stones, at the old man watching me expectantly. Part of me was terrified, wanting nothing more than to wake up from this nightmare and return to my normal life. But another part, a part I barely recognized, was intrigued. Curious about the secrets these people held, the magic they claimed to wield. "If I say yes," and I said slowly, "what happens next?" The old man's face broke into a genuine smile. "Then your real journey begins. You'll learn things you never dreamed possible, see wonders beyond imagination. But be warned, this path is not an easy one. There will be trials, sacrifices to be made." I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could try to run, to fight my way out and report what I'd found. But deep down, I knew I'd never make it, and even if I did, who would believe me? On the other hand, saying yes meant stepping into a world I didn't understand, leaving behind everything I knew. It was terrifying, but also exhilarating. In that moment, standing in that impossible clearing surrounded by ancient magic, I made my choice. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I want to learn." The old man nodded solemnly. "Then let the initiation begin." What happened next is difficult to describe. The robed figures began to chant, their voices blending with the whispers that filled the air. The symbols on the stones blazed with light, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. It was painful and ecstatic all at once, like being unmade and remade in the span of a heartbeat. When it was over, I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. The world around me looked different, sharper, more vibrant. I could feel the pulse of life in every tree, every blade of grass. And the whispers, I could understand them now. The old man helped me to my feet, a look of pride on his face. "Welcome, sister," he said. "Your new life begins now." As the robed figures gathered around me, welcoming me into their fold, I cast one last look at the trail that had led me here. My old life, my identity as a park ranger, seemed like a distant memory already. I didn't know what challenges lay ahead, what secrets I would uncover or powers I would wield. But I knew one thing for certain. My life would never be the same again. The forest had chosen me, and I had accepted. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it. As we made our way deeper into the heart of the forest, leaving behind the world I once knew, I couldn't help but wonder, how many other hidden wonders were out there, waiting to be discovered, and how many other unsuspecting hikers might stumble upon them, forever changing the course of their lives. The forest, it seemed, held far more secrets than I could have ever imagined, and I was now one of them. The first time I saw the other truck's headlights in my rearview mirror, I thought nothing of it. By the third time, I knew I was being hunted. The icy highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of black in a sea of white, and somewhere out there in the darkness, a predator was stalking its prey. My name's Mike, and I've been driving big rigs for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night on Highway 16. It started off as a typical long-haul run. I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Anchorage, a route I'd done dozens of times before. The weather report had warned of a storm coming in, but I figured I could outrun it if I pushed through the night. As the sun set, the temperature dropped rapidly. Snow began to fall, softly at first, then harder. I flicked on my wipers, squinting through the windshield at the road ahead. The highway was empty save for my truck, everyone else having the good sense to hole up for the night. That's when I first noticed the headlights behind me. They appeared suddenly, as if the truck had materialized out of thin air. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just another driver trying to make good time before the storm hit in earnest. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized something was off. The truck behind me was maintaining a constant distance, not attempting to pass even when the road widened. Every time I glanced in my mirror, those headlights were there, unwavering. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was just jumpy from too many hours on the road and too much caffeine. But the nagging sense of wrongness persisted. I decided to test my theory. At the next straight stretch, I eased off the gas, slowing my rig down. The truck behind me slowed too, maintaining that same eerie distance. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal behavior. "Okay, Mike," I muttered to myself. "Let's see what this guy's game is." I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my truck faster than was strictly safe given the worsening weather conditions. The other truck matched my speed exactly, those headlights burning bright in my mirrors. Now I was really starting to freak out. Who was this person? What did they want? My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Highway robbery, Some sick game of cat and mouse. I reached for my CB radio, intending to call for help, but all I got was static. The storm must have been interfering with the signal. I was on my own. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I could barely see the road in front of me, let alone any turnoffs or places I might be able to pull over and lose my pursuer. All I could do was keep driving, hoping to outlast whoever was behind me. Hours seemed to pass, though my dashboard clock told me it had only been about 45 minutes since I first noticed the other truck. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and my rearview mirror. Suddenly, without warning, the truck behind me accelerated. It pulled up alongside me, and for the first time, I got a good look at it. It was an older model, its once white paint now a dirty gray. But what really caught my attention was the driver, or rather, the lack of one. The cab of the truck was empty. I blinked hard, certain I must be hallucinating. But when I looked again, the seat was still unoccupied. The truck was driving itself, keeping perfect pace with me on the slippery road. Terror gripped me. This wasn't possible. Trucks didn't drive themselves. Not out here in the middle of nowhere. Not in a snowstorm. I must be losing my mind. Before I could process what I was seeing, the ghost truck swerved towards me. I yanked the wheel hard, barely avoiding a collision. My trailer fishtailed dangerously, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to jackknife. Somehow, I managed to regain control, but now the game had changed. This wasn't just following anymore. This thing, whatever it was actively trying to run me off the road. I pushed my truck to its limits, speeding down the highway far faster than was safe. The ghost truck kept pace effortlessly, occasionally pulling alongside me and trying to force me off the road. Each time, I managed to evade it, but I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this nightmare. There had to be a town coming up soon, or a highway patrol outpost or something. But all I could see through the swirling snow was more road, stretching endlessly into the night. As I rounded a curve, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a bridge spanning a deep ravine. An idea formed, desperate and dangerous, but it was the only plan I had. I eased off the accelerator slightly, allowing the ghost truck to pull up beside me. Then, just as we hit the bridge, I slammed on my brakes and wrenched the wheel to the right. My truck skidded sideways, the trailer jackknifing behind me. I felt a bone-jarring impact as the ghost truck slammed into my trailer. For a moment, we were locked together, sliding across the icy bridge. Then, with a screech of tearing metal, the ghost truck broke free. I watched in my mirror as it careened off the bridge, plummeting into the darkness below. I managed to bring my own truck to a stop, the cab hanging precariously over the edge of the bridge. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally worked up the courage to look over the edge of the bridge, there was nothing there. No wreckage, no sign of impact in the snow-covered valley below. It was as if the ghost truck had never existed. I don't know how long I sat there trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, I managed to back my truck off the bridge and continue my journey. The storm cleared as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a clear, star-filled sky. When I finally reached Anchorage, nearly 12 hours later than scheduled, I tried to report what had happened. But who would believe me? A ghost truck that drove itself and tried to run me off the road. They'd think I was drunk or sleep-deprived or just plain crazy. So I kept it to myself, delivered my cargo, and tried to forget. But I couldn't shake the memory of those headlights in my mirror, the empty cab of the truck that had hunted me through the night. I still drive that route sometimes, and every time I do, I find myself watching my mirrors a little more closely, especially when the snow starts to fall. Because out there on the lonely highways of the north, where the night seems to go on forever and the storms can appear out of nowhere, anything is possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I see a pair of headlights in the distance, following just a little too close for comfort. When that happens, I push my truck a little faster, grip the wheel a little tighter, and pray that I make it through the night, because now I know the truth. The roads we travel aren't always as empty as they seem, and not all the dangers out there can be explained by the laws of nature or man. So if you're ever driving on a lonely highway late at night, and you see a truck in your rearview mirror that seems to be following just a little too close, don't assume it's just another driver. It might be something else entirely. Something that hunts in the darkness, on roads where the living fear to tread. And if you see it, do what I did. Drive fast, drive smart, and whatever you do, don't look in the cab. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And the ghost truck is always out there, waiting for its next victim on the endless highways of the night. The first time I saw the townspeople gather in the square at midnight, I thought it was just a quaint local tradition. By the third time, I knew I had stumbled upon something far more sinister. This sleepy little town was harboring a dark secret, and my curiosity was about to put me in grave danger. My name's Alex, and I'd moved to Millbrook just 2 months ago to take a job as the town's new social worker. Fresh out of grad school and eager to make a difference, I thought a small town would be the perfect place to start my career. Little did I know, I was walking into a nightmare. Millbrook seemed picture perfect at first glance. Charming Victorian houses lined the streets, flowers bloomed in every yard, and everyone greeted me with a smile. But there was something off about those smiles, something that didn't quite reach the eyes. I first noticed it with Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman I was helping to sign up for meal delivery. As she chatted about her grandchildren, her smile never wavered, even when she mentioned her late husband. It was as if her face was frozen in a permanent mask of pleasantry. Then there was the incident at the local diner. I overheard 2 men arguing in hushed tones, but the moment they noticed me, they switched to talking about the weather, those same eerie smiles plastered on their faces. But it was the midnight gatherings that really set off alarm bells. I first spotted them by chance when I was up late working on reports. A group of people, all ages, silently making their way to the town square. Curious, I followed at a distance. What I saw chilled me to the bone. The entire town seemed to be there, standing in a circle around the old fountain. They were chanting something in a language I didn't recognize, their voices a low, monotonous drone. At the center stood Mayor Wilson, holding what looked like an ancient book. I ducked behind a tree, heart pounding. This couldn't be real. It was like something out of a horror movie. But as I watched, Mayor Wilson raised a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. A young woman stepped forward, offering her palm. The knife flashed, and a trickle of blood dripped into the fountain. I must have made a noise, because suddenly, every head turned in my direction. Dozens of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, fixed on my hiding spot. I ran, not stopping until I was safely back in my apartment, doors locked and curtains drawn. The next day, everything seemed normal. People went about their business, smiling and waving as if nothing had happened. But now I noticed the subtle wrongness, the too perfect lawns, the way everyone moved with an almost mechanical precision, the complete lack of crime or discord in a town this size. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it all, that stress and lack of sleep had caused some sort of hallucination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. I started digging, cautiously at first. I combed through old newspaper archives, looking for anything unusual in the town's history. What I found was disturbing. Every few years, there would be a spate of missing persons cases, tourists, drifters, new residents who didn't stay long, all vanished without a trace. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture became. Millbrook had been founded by a cult back in the 1800s, a group that believed in sacrificing outsiders to ensure prosperity and longevity for its members. Somehow, over the generations, they had managed to keep their practices secret from the outside world. I knew I had to do something to expose what was happening here. But who could I trust? The police chief was at that gathering. So was my boss at the social services office. For all I knew, Every single person in this town was in on it. I decided to gather evidence. I bought a hidden camera and started documenting everything I could. The way people's expressions would slip when they thought no one was looking, revealing something inhuman underneath. The strange symbols carved into the foundations of buildings. The chants I recorded from a distance, which made my skin crawl when I played them back. Weeks passed, and I grew increasingly paranoid. I was sure people were watching me, following me. Mrs. Henderson accidentally bumped into me at the grocery store, her hand lingering on my arm as she apologized. I found my apartment door unlocked one day, even though I was certain I had locked it. Then came the warnings. A dead bird on my doorstep. A note in my mailbox that simply read, "Leave or join us." My car's brake lines mysteriously cut. I knew I had to get out, to take my evidence to the authorities. But every time I tried to leave town, something would go wrong. My car would break down. A sudden storm would wash out the road. Once, I even found myself driving in circles, somehow ending up back in Millbrook no matter which direction I went. It all came to a head on the night of the harvest moon. I was planning my escape, bags packed and hidden in my closet, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Mayor Wilson standing there, flanked by several town elders. "Alex," he said, his voice warm but his eyes cold. "We need to talk." They filed into my apartment, and I knew with a sinking feeling that this was it. They had figured out what I knew. "You've been quite curious about our little town," Mayor Wilson said, settling into my armchair like he owned the place. "We appreciate curiosity, Alex. It's what brings new blood to Millbrook. But there's a point where curiosity becomes problematic." I stood my ground, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know what you're doing. The sacrifices, the cult, all of it. I have evidence. If anything happens to me, it'll go straight to the FBI." The mayor's smile didn't waver, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Oh, Alex, you really don't understand, do you? We've been doing this for centuries. Do you think you're the first to try and expose us?" He gestured, and one of the elders handed him a familiar-looking book. My blood ran cold as I recognized my own journal. "You've been very thorough," Mayor Wilson said, flipping through the pages. "It's impressive, really. In another life, you might have made a fine addition to our community. But now, well, you've left us with a difficult choice." I backed away, looking frantically for an escape route, but they had me cornered. "You see, Alex, Millbrook requires balance. For our prosperity, for our longevity, we must give something in return. Usually, we prefer willing sacrifices. It's cleaner that way. But in cases like yours, exceptions can be made." As he spoke, I noticed a change coming over the elders. Their skin seemed to ripple, features shifting into something inhuman. Their eyes began to glow with the same eerie light I'd seen in the town square. "You have one last choice," Mayor Wilson said, rising from the chair. In his hand, he held a wicked-looking knife. "Join us willingly, become part of our community in truth. Or..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The threat was clear. In that moment, with inhuman creatures closing in around me and a madman offering me accursed salvation, I made my choice. I ran. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was a chase through the darkened streets of Millbrook, the entire town seeming to come alive with malevolent purpose. Somehow, I made it to the town limits, my lungs burning and terror giving me speed I never knew I possessed. As I crossed the invisible boundary, I heard an unearthly howl behind me. Looking back, I saw the townsfolk stopped at the edge of Millbrook, unable or unwilling to step beyond its borders. I didn't stop running until I reached the next town over, collapsing in front of the sheriff's station. They didn't believe my wild tale, of course. When they sent deputies to investigate, they reported back that Millbrook seemed perfectly normal. I never returned to that cursed town. I left the state, changed my name, tried to start a new life, but I can never shake the memories of what I saw there, or the knowledge that somewhere out there, an entire town of monsters continues its dark rituals, hidden in plain sight. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear chanting on the wind. And I wonder, how many other Millbrooks are out there, their sinister secrets masked behind picket fences and friendly smiles? How many unsuspecting people are drawn into their web, never to be seen again? I may have escaped, but the horror of Millbrook will haunt me forever. And I know that somewhere out there, Mayor Wilson and his inhuman followers are watching, waiting for the day I let my guard down. Because once you've seen behind the mask, there's no going back. You're either with them, or you're their next sacrifice. The laughter echoed through the empty corridors, a chilling sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the jovial laughter of patients enjoying a moment of levity. No, this was something else entirely, a sound that had no place in a psychiatric hospital at 2 a.m. I'm Nurse Sarah, and I've been working the night shift at Evergreen Psychiatric Hospital for the past 5 years. I thought I'd seen it all. Violent outbursts, bizarre delusions, the works, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. It started as a typical shift. I made my rounds, checking on patients and administering medications. The hospital was quiet, save for the occasional muffled snore or creak of the old building settling. I was at the nurses' station, catching up on paperwork, when I first heard it. A soft giggle, barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. I looked up, frowning. It was coming from down the hall, near room 237. That was odd. The patient in 237, Mr. Johnson, was heavily sedated. He shouldn't have been awake, let alone laughing. I got up to investigate, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As I approached room 237, the laughter grew louder, more maniacal. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Something felt wrong, very wrong. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the monitoring equipment. Mr. Johnson lay in his bed, exactly as he should be, still and silent. The laughter had stopped. I checked his vitals. Everything normal. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I whirled around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just shadows and medical equipment. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." Back at the nurse's station, I tried to focus on my paperwork, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The hospital felt different somehow, as if the very air had changed. That's when I heard it again. Laughter, this time from the opposite direction. It was coming from the day room, a space that should have been empty and locked at this hour. Against my better judgment, I went to check it out. The laughter grew louder as I approached. Not just one voice now, but many. It sounded like a party in full swing. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking slightly as I unlocked the day room door. The laughter cut off abruptly as I swung it open. The room was empty, chairs neatly stacked against the wall. No sign of any patients, no reason for the sounds I'd heard. But the air felt charged, as if something had just vacated the space. I backed out of the room, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, palms sweaty. What was going on? I decided to do a full sweep of the ward, checking each patient's room. Everything seemed normal at first. Patients sleeping peacefully, monitors beeping steadily. But with each room I checked, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. It was in room 252 that I saw it. Just for a second, as I was turning to leave. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving across the wall. It wasn't cast by anything in the room. It moved independently, flowing like smoke. I blinked hard, and it was gone. But I knew what I'd seen. My rational mind tried to explain it away. A trick of the light, exhaustion playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Back at the nurse's station, I found my colleague, Mike, had arrived for his medication rounds. The sight of another person was immensely comforting. "Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "have you noticed anything strange tonight?" He looked at me quizzically. "Strange how?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "Just odd noises, shadows where they shouldn't be." Mike's expression changed, a flicker of something, fear, crossing his face before he composed himself. "It's probably nothing. This old building makes all sorts of noises." But I could tell he was holding something back. "Mike, what aren't you telling me?" He sighed, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Look, I didn't want to say anything because I thought I was imagining it. But since you asked, yeah, I've been seeing things, hearing things. It's been getting worse over the past few weeks." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of things?" "Shadows moving on their own, whispers when there's no one around, and the patients." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "What about the patients?" I pressed. "They've been talking about seeing things too, even the ones who are usually lucid. They say there's something in the hospital, something that comes out at night." I was about to respond when a scream cut through the air, high-pitched and terrified. We both jumped, then raced towards the sound. It was coming from room 224, home to Angela, a schizophrenic patient who was usually calm on her meds. We burst into the room to find Angela huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here!" she shrieked. "Can't you see them? They're everywhere!" I approached her cautiously. "Angela, it's okay. You're safe. There's nothing here." But as I said it, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The shadows in the room seemed to be shifting, coalescing into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Angela pointed a shaking finger over my shoulder. "Behind you." I spun around, my heart in my throat. For a split second, I saw it clearly. A figure made of darkness, its edges blurred and shifting. It had no face, just a blank void where features should be. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows. Mike had seen it too, judging by his pale face and shocked expression. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the lights began to flicker. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Angela's terrified whimpers were drowned out by a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows were moving again, but this time they didn't retreat. They grew, spreading across the walls and floor, reaching out with tendrils of darkness. I felt a touch on my arm, cold as ice and undeniably real. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Angela with one hand and Mike with the other. We bolted from the room, the whispers rising to a feverish pitch behind us. The entire ward was in chaos. Patients were screaming, alarms blaring. The shadows pursued us, flowing down the corridors like a flood of ink. We ran for the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. "The emergency exit?" Mike gasped. "In the basement." We raced down the stairs, the darkness nipping at our heels. I could hear other footsteps joining ours, staff and patients, all fleeing the encroaching shadows. The basement was pitch black, but Mike found the emergency exit, slamming into the push bar. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it wouldn't open. Then it gave way, and we spilled out into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. Looking back, I saw shadows writhing in the windows of the hospital, as if the entire building was being consumed from within. As we stood there, gasping for breath, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. We had seen something that defied explanation, something that shattered our understanding of reality. The authorities arrived soon after. Drawn by the alarms and our frantic calls, they evacuated the building, but found no trace of the shadows or anything unusual. The official report blamed a gas leak for the mass hallucination. But I know what I saw. What we all saw. Something ancient and malevolent had awakened in Evergreen Psychiatric Hospital. Whether it was always there, feeding on the fears and delusions of the patients, or whether it was summoned by some unknown force. I'll never know. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't bring myself to set foot in that building again. Many others did the same. The hospital closed down shortly after, unable to recover from the scandal and unable to hire new staff willing to work there. Sometimes, when I drive past the abandoned building at night, I swear I can hear faint laughter echoing from its dark windows. And I wonder, is it really empty? Or did we just leave those poor souls behind to face the darkness alone? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at shadows the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes the things we dismiss as tricks of the light or figments of our imagination are all too real. And they're waiting, in the dark corners of old buildings and the recesses of our minds, ready to emerge when the night is long and our guard is down. The moment the rusted metal door creaked open, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The stale air that rushed out carried the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and malevolent. But it was too late to turn back now. We'd come too far, and our curiosity would be our undoing. I'm Jake, and I never thought a weekend hiking trip with my friends would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Mike and Lisa. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to explore the remote wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. The hike started off great. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with a clear blue sky overhead. We joked and laughed as we made our way along the trail, taking in the breathtaking views of the forest-covered mountains. It was Tom who first spotted the old mine shaft. We'd gone off the main trail, looking for a shortcut back to our campsite, when he called out, "Hey guys, check this out." We gathered around, peering at the half-hidden entrance partly obscured by overgrown vegetation. The wooden supports were rotted and sagging, and a rusted sign warned of danger. But there was something enticing about it, a mystery begging to be explored. "We shouldn't go in there," Sarah said, voicing the concern we all felt. "It's not safe." But Mike, always the daredevil, was already pulling out his flashlight. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? We'll just take a quick look." I should have sided with Sarah, should have insisted we turn back, but the allure of the unknown was too strong. "Yeah, just a quick peek," I found myself saying. "What's the worst that could happen?" Those words would come back to haunt me. The entrance was narrower than it looked, and we had to squeeze through one at a time. The beam of Mike's flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, revealing a tunnel that stretched into darkness. The air was thick and musty, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. "This is awesome," Tom whispered, his voice echoing slightly. "Imagine what we might find down here." We moved deeper into the mine, our excitement slowly giving way to a growing sense of unease. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading us further underground. I tried to keep track of our route, but it soon became impossible. We were lost in a maze of dark passages. That's when we found the first body. Mike's flashlight beam swept across it, and for a moment, we all froze in horror. It was little more than a skeleton, clothed in the tattered remains of what might have been mining gear. But it wasn't an old corpse. The bones were clean, as if they'd been picked clean recently. "And we need to get out of here," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "Now." But as we turned to leave, we realized with growing panic that we couldn't remember which way we'd come. Every tunnel looked the same in the dim light of our flashlights. "Okay, let's not panic," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll pick a direction and stick to it. We're bound to find the exit eventually." We chose a tunnel at random and started walking, but with each step, the feeling that we were going deeper into the mine grew stronger. The air became colder, and the silence was broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional drip of water. That's when we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, echoing from somewhere in the darkness behind us. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Tom's arm. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, closer this time, and then, in the beam of our flashlights, we saw something move. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At first, I thought it was a man, but as it came closer, I realized how wrong I was. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over elongated limbs. Its face was a nightmare, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, and a mouth full of sharp, needle-like teeth. We ran. Panic gave us speed, and we tore through the tunnels, no longer caring about finding the exit, just desperate to get away from the creature behind us. I could hear its snarls echoing off the walls, growing louder as it gained on us. We burst into a large cavern, and for a moment, I thought we might have found a way out. But then our flashlights revealed the horror that awaited us. The cavern was filled with bones, hundreds, maybe thousands of skeletons scattered across the floor, and they weren't all human. Some were twisted, malformed, as if they belonged to creatures that should not exist. "Oh God," Lisa whimpered. "What is this place?" But we had no time to ponder the question. The creature burst into the cavern behind us, and it wasn't alone. More of them poured in from other tunnels, their eyes gleaming with hunger. "There," Tom shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the far wall. "We might be able to squeeze through." It was our only chance. We ran for it, the creatures hot on our heels. I could feel their hot breath on the back of my neck as we reached the crevice. Sarah went first, then Lisa. Mike was next, but as he tried to squeeze through, he got stuck. I could see the terror in his eyes as he realized he was trapped. "Go," he shouted at Tom and me. "I'll hold them off." I wanted to argue, to try and pull him free, but there was no time. The creatures were upon us. Tom shoved me towards the crevice and I squeezed through, the rough stone scraping my skin. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Mike, turning to face the horde of monsters, his face set in grim determination. We emerged on the other side, in a tunnel that sloped upwards. Hope surged through me. This had to lead to the surface. We ran, our lungs burning, driven by the sounds of pursuit that still echoed behind us. Finally, mercifully, we saw light ahead. With a last burst of speed, we burst out of the mine into the fading daylight. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. It was only then that the full horror of what had happened hit us. Mike was gone, left behind in that nightmare cavern, and we had no idea if the creatures could follow us out into the world above. We broke camp in record time, not even bothering to pack everything up. The hike back to our car was a blur of fear and exhaustion. We drove straight to the nearest police station, but our story was met with skepticism and concern for our mental state. A search party was sent out, but they found no trace of Mike or the mine entrance we'd described. It was as if the whole thing had vanished, swallowed up by the mountains. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some sort of shared hallucination, a bad trip from some toxic gas in the mine? But deep down, we all knew the truth. What we'd seen was real, no matter how impossible it seemed. We made a pact never to speak of it again, to try and move on with our lives. But the nightmares persisted. In my dreams, I'm back in that cavern, surrounded by bones and glowing eyes, hearing Mike's final shout echoing in the darkness. I've never gone hiking again. The others, as far as I know, haven't either. We've drifted apart, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own way. But sometimes, late at night, I'll get a text from one of them, just a single word: remember. And I know they're lying awake too, haunted by the memories of what we found in that mine. I don't know what those creatures were or why they were there. Some ancient, underground species. The results of some terrible experiment, or something even worse, something not of this world. I'll probably never know. But one thing's for certain. There are things in this world that defy explanation, horrors lurking just below the surface of what we think we know. And sometimes, Curiosity leads us to places we were never meant to go. So if you're ever hiking in the mountains and you come across an old, abandoned mine shaft, do yourself a favor. Keep walking. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't go inside, because you never know what might be waiting in the darkness, hungry for its next victim. As for me, I'll stick to the well-traveled paths from now on, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if one day those creatures might find their way to the surface. And if they do, God help us all. The first twig snap could have been a deer, the second maybe a raccoon, but the third, followed by that low, guttural growl. That's when I knew our family camping trip had just become a fight for survival. My name's Jack, and I've been taking my family camping for years. My wife, Sarah, and our kids, Emma, 10, and Liam, 8, always looked forward to our annual retreat into nature. This year, we'd chosen a remote spot in the Adirondacks, miles from the nearest town or cell phone signal. It was supposed to be an escape from the chaos of modern life. Instead, it became a nightmare I'll never forget. The day had started perfectly. We'd hiked to our campsite, set up our tent, and spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The kids were giggling, the stars were out, and for a moment, everything felt right with the world. It was just after midnight when I first heard it, a rustling in the undergrowth, too heavy to be small wildlife. I sat up, alert, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. "What is it, honey?" Sarah asked. Noticing my tension, I forced a smile. "Probably nothing, just gonna check it out." I grabbed our flashlight and stood up, shining the beam into the woods. The light caught a pair of eyes, reflecting back at me for just a second before disappearing. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, frightened. "What's out there?" "Just some animals, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Nothing to worry about. Why don't you and Liam get ready for bed?" As Sarah ushered the kids into the tent, I did another sweep of our campsite's perimeter. Nothing seemed out of place, Kurtos, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We all crawled into the tent, but sleep was elusive. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. The kids finally drifted off, but Sarah and I lay awake, listening. It was around 2 a.m. when we heard it clearly, footsteps, circling our tent. Heavy, deliberate steps that no animal would make. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Before I could answer, a shadow fell across our tent. Something large was right outside, its silhouette visible through the thin fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever it was could hear it. Then, without warning, an unearthly howl split the night. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Part wolf, part something else entirely. The kids jerked awake, Liam letting out a frightened whimper. "Shh," I said, pulling them close. "We need to be very quiet." The shadow moved, circling our tent. I could hear sniffing, as if it was trying to catch our scent. Then, silence. For a long, tense moment, we all held our breath, waiting. Suddenly, claws raked across the side of the tent, shredding the fabric. Emma screamed, and all hell broke loose. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it through the new hole in our tent. For a split second, I saw it, a creature that looked like a wolf, but much larger, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. "Run!" I shouted, unzipping the tent. We burst out into the night, the cool air hitting us like a slap to the face. I scooped up Liam, Sarah grabbed Emma, and we took off into the woods. Behind us, I could hear the creature snarling, its heavy footfalls in pursuit. My mind raced, trying to remember the route back to our car. But in the darkness, with panic clouding my thoughts, every tree looked the same. We stumbled through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Liam was sobbing into my shoulder, and I could hear Emma's frightened gasps as Sarah pulled her along. "There!" Sarah shouted, pointing ahead. A clearing loomed, moonlight illuminating a rocky outcropping. "We can climb up there." It was our only chance. We scrambled up the rocks, the rough stones scraping our hands and knees. Just as we reached the top, a dark shape burst from the tree line. In the moonlight, I could finally see our pursuer clearly. It was like a wolf, but the size of a bear, with matted fur and yellowed fangs. But its eyes were the worst part. Intelligent, almost human, filled with a malevolent hunger. It circled the base of the outcropping, looking for a way up. We huddled together, watching in horror as it started to climb. "We're trapped," Sarah whispered, clutching the kids close. I looked around desperately for anything we could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a loose boulder, precariously balanced on the edge of the outcropping. "Sarah, take the kids to the other side," I said, moving towards the boulder. "When I say now, run for the trees." "Jack, no!" Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what I was planning. "It's our only chance," I said, my voice cracking. "Please, just be ready." The creature was halfway up now, its claws scraping against the rock as it climbed. I positioned myself behind the boulder, my hands against its rough surface. Timing would be everything. Just as the creature reached the top, its massive paw appearing over the edge, I shoved with all my might. The boulder teetered for a heart-stopping moment, then began to roll. "Now!" I shouted. Sarah and the kids scrambled down the other side of the outcropping as the boulder picked up speed. The creature looked up just in time to see its doom approaching. There was an awful yelp, cut short by a sickening crunch as the boulder struck home. I slid down the rocks, my heart in my throat as I ran to where my family had disappeared into the trees. "Sarah! Kids! Here!" Sarah's voice called out. They emerged from behind a large oak, pale and shaking but alive. We didn't wait to see if the creature had survived. We ran through the woods, guided by pure adrenaline and the first faint light of dawn breaking through the trees. Somehow, miraculously, we found the trail back to our car. As we sped away from the campsite, the kids huddled in the back seat wrapped in emergency blankets. The full weight of what had happened began to sink in. We'd been attacked by something that shouldn't exist, something out of a nightmare. We drove straight to the nearest ranger station, but our story was met with skepticism. They sent out a search party, but found no sign of the creature or any unusual tracks. Our shredded tent and the remains of our campsite were the only evidence that anything had happened at all. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what we'd encountered. I scoured the internet for similar stories, for any explanation of what we'd seen. There were tales of dogmen, of werewolves, of creatures that lurked in the deep woods, but nothing quite matched what we'd experienced. The nightmares came every night. In my dreams, I'm back on that outcropping, but this time the boulder misses. I wake up in a cold sweat, reaching out to make sure Sarah and the kids are safe beside me. We never went camping again. The kids developed a fear of the dark that took years of therapy to overcome. Sarah and I found our marriage tested by the strain of what we'd been through, but ultimately strengthened by the shared trauma. Years have passed, but I still find myself looking over my shoulder when I'm outdoors at night. Every shadow seems to hide potential danger. Every rustle in the bushes sets my heart racing. I know now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is right, I swear I can hear a distant howl. It makes me wonder, was our encounter just a fluke? Or are there more of those creatures out there, waiting in the darkness for unsuspecting campers to stumble into their territory? I don't have answers, only questions that keep me up at night. But I do know this. The next time you're planning a camping trip, maybe stick to the crowded campgrounds, because out in the deep woods, where the shadows are long and the night is dark, you never know what might be watching. waiting for its chance to strike. As for me and my family, we'll stick to the safety of our backyard for our adventures from now on. Some risks just aren't worth taking, no matter how beautiful the wilderness might be. Because now we know that sometimes, when you venture into nature, nature ventures back, with teeth and claws at the ready. The moment I found the first hidden camera, I knew this house held darker secrets than peeling paint and creaky floorboards. What started as a routine job preparing a property for sale quickly became a descent into a nightmare of voyeurism and obsession that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Alex, and I've been a real estate agent for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of quirky houses and eccentric former owners, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered at 42 Maple Street. It was a sunny Tuesday morning when I first pulled up to the old Victorian. The house had been left to the bank after its owner, a reclusive old man named Gerald Hoffman, had passed away with no apparent heirs. My job was simple: get the place cleaned up and ready for market. From the outside, it looked like any other neglected property. Paint peeling, gutters sagging, overgrown yard. Nothing I hadn't dealt with 100 times before. I let myself in with the key the bank had provided, breathing in the musty air of a home long unlived in. The interior was cluttered, but not unusually so for an elderly person living alone. Stacks of old newspapers, shelves lined with dusty knickknacks, furniture that had seen better days. I made my way through the rooms, making mental notes of what needed to be done. It was in the study that I found the first camera. I was examining the bookshelf, thinking about how long it would take to clear out, when I noticed something odd about one of the books. It was too rigid, and when I pulled it out, I realized it was a fake, a hollow cover concealing a small, high-tech camera. My blood ran cold as I stared at the device. Why would someone hide a camera in their own study? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe old Gerald was paranoid about burglars, but something in my gut told me this was just the tip of the iceberg. I was right. Over the next few hours, I found more cameras. They were everywhere, hidden in light fixtures, concealed behind paintings, tucked into the corners of rooms. Each discovery sent a fresh wave of unease through me. This wasn't paranoia. This was something far more sinister. But it was what I found in the basement that truly chilled me to the bone. The door was locked, but I managed to force it open. The stairs creaked ominously as I descended, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there, taking up half the basement, was a setup that belonged in a spy movie. Banks of monitors lined one wall, each connected to one of the hidden cameras I'd found upstairs. But it wasn't just the inside of the house that was under surveillance. There were views of the street, the neighbors, homes, even the inside of the house next door. My hands shook as I moved deeper into the room. The filing cabinets lined another wall, and when I opened one, I found it full of meticulously labeled folders. Each contained photos, notes, and what looked like transcripts of conversations. Gerald hadn't just been watching his neighbors. He'd been documenting their every move. I felt sick. This was so much worse than I could have imagined. I needed to call the police, to report what I'd found. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something that made my heart stop. A door, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. A door that had no business being there. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that basement and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a creak that seemed to echo in the silence of the basement. And there, in a room no bigger than a closet, was a bed. A small, neatly made bed with restraints attached to the frame. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This wasn't just voyeurism. This was something far more terrible. Had Gerald been kidnapping people, holding them prisoner in this secret room? I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had to get out, had to call the police. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The front door was opening. I froze, listening intently. Footsteps, moving through the house. But that was impossible. I had the only key, unless Gerald wasn't as dead as everyone thought. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically for a place to hide, acutely aware of the irony. In a house full of hidden surveillance equipment, I was now the one trying not to be seen. I ducked into a nearby closet, pulling the door closed just as the basement door creaked open. Through a crack, I could see a figure descending the stairs. It wasn't Gerald. This person was younger, moved more smoothly. A relative, perhaps. Someone who had inherited his twisted legacy. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back of the closet. I could hear them moving around in the basement, and then the unmistakable sound of computer equipment powering up. They were activating the surveillance system. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I stood there, barely daring to breathe, my mind racing. How was I going to get out of this? Even if I managed to sneak past them, they'd know someone had been here. They'd see me on the cameras. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard them coming back up the stairs. They paused at the top, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought they were going to check the closet. But then they moved on, their footsteps receding towards the front of the house. I waited until I heard the front door close before I allowed myself to breathe again. On shaky legs, I emerged from the closet. I had to get out of there, had to report what I'd found. But I knew I couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Whoever had just been here clearly had access to the house, might even be working with the bank. I needed proof. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way back down to the basement. The computers were still on, the screen showing live feeds from around the house. I found a USB drive in one of the drawers and started copying files as quickly as I could. It was as I was doing this that I noticed something on one of the monitors. The feed from the camera hidden in the porch light showed a car pulling up outside. The same car that had just left. They were coming back. I yanked the USB drive out of the computer, not waiting to see if the file transfer was complete. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the key in the lock as I reached the top of the stairs. There was no time to think. I ran for the back door, fumbling with the lock. Behind me, I could hear the front door opening. With a final desperate shove, the back door gave way, and I burst out into the overgrown yard. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked a block away. As I sped away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There was no sign of pursuit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I turned the USB drive over to a journalist friend who promised to investigate. The story broke a month later, a scandalous expose of a decades-long campaign of surveillance and stalking, with hints of even darker crimes. The police raided the house, but whoever had been there that day was long gone. The basement had been cleared out, all evidence erased. If it wasn't for the files I'd managed to copy, there would have been no proof of what I'd seen. I quit my job at the real estate agency soon after. I couldn't handle the thought of walking into another house, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind its walls. Even now, years later, I find myself checking for hidden cameras whenever I enter a new place. The house at 42 Maple Street was eventually demolished. A park stands there now, bright and cheerful. But sometimes, when I drive past, I swear I can feel eyes on me. And I wonder, how many other houses are out there, hiding similar secrets? How many Gerald Hoffmans are watching us right now, documenting our every move? I may never know the full truth of what happened in that house, but one thing's for certain. I'll never look at an old Victorian the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes they're hiding behind the walls, watching and waiting, their secrets preserved in the silent blink of a hidden camera. The first flicker of headlights in the rearview mirror filled me with relief. The second made me uneasy. By the third, I knew with chilling certainty that those approaching lights didn't promise rescue, but a terror beyond anything I could have imagined. My name's Sarah, and what should have been a routine family road trip turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. It was supposed to be a simple drive to my parents' house for Thanksgiving. Me, my husband Mike, and our 2 kids, Ethan, 10, and Lily, 7. We'd made this trip a dozen times before, but never this late at night. We'd gotten a late start due to Mike's work, and by the time we hit the long stretch of rural highway between cities, it was well past midnight. The kids were asleep in the back, and Mike and I were taking turns driving to stay alert. I was behind the wheel when it happened. One moment, we were cruising along, the radio playing softly, and the next, our car made a sputtering sound and started to slow. "What's going on?" Mike asked, jolting awake from his light doze. I frowned, pressing the gas pedal harder, but the car continued to decelerate. "I don't know. Something's wrong." We coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the road, the darkness pressing in around us. Mike tried to restart the car, but the engine just made a sad clicking noise. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling out his phone. No signal. Of course. I felt a knot of unease forming in my stomach. We were miles from anywhere, with no way to call for help. The empty highway stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the night. That's when I saw the first glimmer of headlights in the distance behind us. Relief washed over me. Someone was coming. We'd be okay. "Look," I said to Mike, pointing. "Maybe they can help." We got out of the car, waving our arms to flag down the approaching vehicle, but as it got closer, something felt off. The headlights were too bright, too high off the ground, and they were moving erratically, swerving slightly from side to side. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Just as the vehicle was about to reach us, it suddenly swerved sharply, speeding past us and disappearing into the night. "What the hell?" Mike said, staring after it. Before I could respond, I saw more headlights approaching from the opposite direction. This time, a normal-looking sedan slowed as it neared us. An older man rolled down his window. "You folks okay?" "Our car broke down," I explained quickly. "Do you have a phone we could use to call for help?" The man's expression changed from concern to fear. "You need to get out of here, now." "What? Why?" Mike asked, confused. The man glanced nervously down the road. "There's been talk of things happening on this stretch of highway. People going missing, strange lights, what you don't want to be out here after dark." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, things?" But the man was already rolling up his window. "I'm sorry, I can't stay. Good luck." And with that, he sped off, leaving us alone in the darkness once more. Mike and I shared a look of disbelief and growing fear. What had the man meant? And what were we going to do now? That's when we saw the third set of headlights. They appeared suddenly, much closer than they should have been, and they were coming straight for us, moving far too fast. "Get in the car!" I screamed, yanking open the door and diving inside. Mike barely made it in before the vehicle roared past us, missing our car by inches. The kids woke up, startled and confused. "Mom? Dad? What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice small and frightened. "It's okay, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're just having some car trouble. Everything's fine." But as I spoke, I saw more headlights appearing in the distance, not just 1 or 2 pairs, but several, and they were all heading towards us. "Mike," I whispered, my voice shaking, "we need to get out of here." He nodded, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. "I'll try the engine again." As he turned the key, I watched the approaching lights with growing terror. They were getting closer, and I could now see that they weren't normal vehicles. Some were too high, others too low to the ground, and they were moving in a way that no human-driven car would move, weaving and bobbing like predators, stalking their prey. The engine sputtered, coughed, and miraculously roared to life. Mike didn't wait. He slammed the car into drive and peeled onto the highway. "Mommy, I'm scared," Lily whimpered from the back seat. "It's okay, baby," I said, reaching back to grab her hand. We're going to be fine. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I knew I was lying. The lights were following us, gaining speed. And now I could see shapes moving in the darkness between the lights, huge, misshapen things that loped alongside the strange vehicles. Mike was pushing our car to its limits, the engine whining in protest, but it wasn't enough. The lights were getting closer, and with them came a sound, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "What are they?" Ethan asked, his face pressed against the rear window. "Don't look," I said sharply. "Just don't look." The hum was getting louder, drowning out the sound of our engine, of the wind rushing past. It was all-encompassing, making my head spin and my vision blur. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. The dashboard lights, the headlights, even the lights pursuing us, all gone in an instant. We were plunged into total, absolute darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a blinding light flooded the car from above. It was so bright it hurt, and I squeezed my eyes shut against it. I felt the car lifting, rising off the ground. The kids were screaming. Mike was yelling something I couldn't make out over the deafening hum. My ears popped as we ascended, and I felt a pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Just when I thought I was going to pass out, everything stopped. The light, the noise, the feeling of rising, it all ceased in an instant. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the sudden return to darkness. We were back on the road, our car idling quietly as if nothing had happened. The highway stretched out before us, empty and normal. Is everyone okay?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse. There were shaky affirmatives from Mike and the kids. We all seemed to be unharmed but deeply shaken. "What happened?" Ethan asked. "Were those aliens?" "I don't know, honey," I said honestly. "I really don't know." We drove in silence after that, all of us jumping at every set of headlights we saw in the distance. But nothing unusual happened for the rest of our journey. We made it to my parents' house, just as the sun was rising, exhausted and confused. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We searched online for reports of similar incidents, but found nothing concrete. The stretch of highway where it had occurred had a history of strange occurrences, but nothing as extreme as what we'd experienced. We debated whether to report it to the authorities, but in the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We had no proof, no evidence of what we'd seen and experienced, but the memory of that night stayed with us. The kids had nightmares for months. Mike and I found ourselves avoiding driving at night whenever possible, and I never looked at headlights in my rearview mirror the same way again. Years have passed, and we've never experienced anything like that again. But sometimes, on dark nights when I'm driving alone, I'll catch a glimpse of strange lights in my mirror, and for a moment, I'm back on that highway, feeling the hum in my bones and the terror in my heart. I don't know what happened to us that night. Were they aliens? Some kind of interdimensional beings? Or something else entirely? Something our minds can't even comprehend? I'll probably never know for sure. But one thing I do know. The night isn't as empty as we think it is. There are things out there in the darkness, things that watch and wait, and sometimes, just sometimes, reach out to touch our world. And when they do, all we can do is hold on tight and pray we make it through to the other side. So the next time you're driving down a dark, lonely road and you see headlights approaching in your mirror, pay attention, because you never know when those lights might be bringing something more than just another traveler passing in the night. The moment I saw the first drop of blood on the polished floor, I knew this night shift would be unlike any other. What started as a routine cleanup in an empty mall quickly spiraled into a heart-pounding game of cat and mouse with a killer who was still in the building. My name's Carlos, and I've been working as a janitor at the Pinewood Mall for the past 3 years. Night shifts were usually quiet affairs, just me, my mop, and the occasional security guard making their rounds. But that night, everything changed. It was a Tuesday, typically our slowest day. I'd started my shift at 10 p.m., just after the last of the stragglers from the cinema had left. The mall always felt different at night, like a sleeping giant. The echoes of my footsteps in the empty corridors, the hum of the air conditioning, the occasional flicker of a fluorescent light. It all added to an atmosphere that was both peaceful and slightly eerie. I was making my way through the food court, wiping down tables and chairs, when I first noticed it. A small, dark spot on the gleaming floor near the burger barn. At first, I thought it was just a spilled drink, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was blood, no doubt about it. My first thought was that someone had cut themselves and hadn't noticed. It happens sometimes. A shopper with a small injury leaving a trail without realizing it. But as I followed the droplets, a chill ran down my spine. They were leading away from the food court, towards the service corridors. I should have called security right then. Should have reported it and let them handle it. But curiosity got the better of me. I'd worked in this mall for years, knew every nook and cranny. If someone was hurt, maybe I could help. The trail led me to a door marked "Employees Only." It was slightly ajar, which was unusual. These doors were always supposed to be locked at night. My hand shook slightly as I pushed it open, the hinges creaking ominously in the silence. The service corridor was dark, lit only by the dim glow of emergency exit signs. The blood trail was more pronounced here, smeared along the wall as if someone had been stumbling, using the wall for support. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the narrow space. "Is anyone hurt? Do you need help?" No response, just the faint drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the distance. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. It led to another door, this one leading to the basement storage area. As I reached for the handle, I heard it, a muffled thump from the other side, followed by what sounded like a choked sob. Adrenaline surged through me. Someone was definitely in there, and they were in trouble. I yanked the door open, ready to rush to their aid. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The storage room was dimly lit by a single bulb, casting long shadows across stacks of boxes and old mannequins. And there, in the center of the room, was a scene straight out of a nightmare. A man stood with his back to me, hunched over something on the floor. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized with horror that the something was a person. They weren't moving. The man must have heard the door open because he suddenly straightened up and turned around. In his hand was a knife, its blade dark with blood. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I saw the madness in his gaze, the flecks of blood on his face. He saw me, a witness to his crime. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed the door shut and ran, my feet pounding against the linoleum floor. Behind me, I heard the storage room door burst open, followed by the sound of pursuit. My mind raced as I sprinted through the service corridors. I needed to get to security, to call for help. But the security office was on the other side of the mall. Could I make it? I burst out of the service area into the main concourse, my eyes darting around frantically for anything I could use to defend myself. The shuttered storefronts offered no refuge. The food court, with its maze of tables and chairs, might slow him down, but it would slow me down too. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. He was there, maybe 50 feet behind me, his face contorted with rage. He ditched the knife for a fire axe he must have grabbed from one of the emergency stations. Terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I raced past darkened shops, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The security office was just ahead, past the fountain in the central plaza. I was almost there when my foot hit a slick spot on the floor, probably something I'd missed during my earlier cleaning. I went down hard, sliding across the polished tiles. Pain shot through my knee, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, limping now but still pushing forward. The security office door was locked. Of course it was locked. Why wouldn't it be? I pounded on it, screaming for help. But I knew it was useless. The night guard, Dave, was probably on his rounds. Who knew how long it would be before he came back? I turned, my back pressed against the door, to face my pursuer. He had slowed to a walk now, a twisted smile on his face. He knew he had me cornered. "Please," I gasped, holding up my hands. "You don't have to do this." He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the empty mall. "Oh, but I do," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Can't leave any witnesses, you understand?" He raised the axe, and I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But it never came. Instead, I heard a loud thwack, followed by a grunt of pain. I opened my eyes to see the killer crumpling to the ground, the axe clattering from his grasp. Behind him stood Dave, the night guard, holding his heavy flashlight like a club. "Carlos," Dave said, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell is going on?" The next few hours were a blur. Police swarmed the mall, cordoning off areas and taking statements. The killer, it turned out, was wanted for a string of murders across 3 states. The person in the storage room had been his latest victim, a young woman who, thankfully, was still alive and was rushed to the hospital. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, I couldn't stop shaking. The reality of how close I'd come to death was sinking in. If Dave hadn't come back from his rounds when he did, in the days and weeks that followed, I was hailed as a hero. If I hadn't investigated the blood trail, they said, the killer might have escaped and the woman might have died. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt lucky and terrified and forever changed. I quit my job at the mall soon after. Couldn't stand to walk those corridors again, knowing what had happened there. The nightmares were bad enough without having to relive it every night at work. Now, years later, I still can't look at a mall the same way. Every darkened storefront hides potential danger. Every echo in a quiet corridor sends my heart racing. I know, logically, that what happened that night was a freak occurrence. But logic doesn't help much when you've stared death in the face. Sometimes, when I'm up late at night and the house is quiet, I find myself thinking about that killer, about the madness I saw in his eyes, the casualness with which he was prepared to end my life. And I wonder, how many other monsters are out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to strike? I don't have an answer, but I do know this. The world is not as safe as we pretend it is. Danger lurks in the most unexpected places, and sometimes, the difference between life and death is nothing more than a locked door, a well-timed rescue, or a patch of slippery floor. So the next time you're alone in a quiet place, and you hear an unexpected sound or see something that doesn't quite fit, pay attention. It might be nothing, or it might be the first warning sign of a nightmare about to unfold. And in those moments, trust your instincts. They just might save your life. The first time I heard the scratching in the walls, I dismissed it as mice. By the third night, when the whispers started, I knew I'd rented a room in a house of horrors. But it wasn't until I found the hidden door that I realized just how deep the nightmare went. My name's Jamie, and I'm a grad student at the local university. When I found the ad for a cheap room in a beautiful old Victorian house, it seemed too good to be true. Turns out, it was. The house was gorgeous from the outside, all gingerbread trim and stained glass windows. The landlord, Mr. Vance, was a soft-spoken older man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He showed me around, pointing out the original hardwood floors and intricate moldings. The room he offered was spacious and bright, with a bay window overlooking the garden. "It's perfect," I said, already imagining my books lining the built-in shelves. "When can I move in?" Mr. Vance's smile widened. "How about today?" I should have wondered why he was so eager to rent the room. Should have asked why the rent was so low for such a beautiful space. but I was too excited about my luck to question it. The first few days were great. I settled in, started my classes, and enjoyed the quiet of the old house. There were a few other tenants, a young couple on the second floor and an elderly woman in the attic apartment, but I rarely saw them. It was on the fourth night that things started to get weird. I was up late studying when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from inside the wall. I figured it was mice and made a mental note to tell Mr. Vance in the morning. But the next night, the scratching was louder, more insistent. And it wasn't just coming from one spot. It seemed to be moving through the walls, circling my room. I tried to ignore it, cranking up my music to drown it out. On the sixth night, the whisper started. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the pipes settling. But as I lay in bed, straining to hear, I could make out words, fragments of sentences, too quiet to understand, but definitely human voices. I confronted Mr. Vance the next morning. "Is this house haunted?" I asked, feeling silly even as I said it. He looked at me with concern. "Haunted? No. This is a very old house, though. It makes all sorts of noises, nothing to worry about." But I was worried. The scratching and whispers continued every night, growing louder and more frequent. I started having trouble sleeping, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I made the discovery that would change everything. I was pacing my room, trying to pinpoint where the sounds were coming from, when I noticed something odd about the bookshelf. One section seemed to stick out slightly more than the rest. Heart pounding, I ran my fingers along the edge of the shelf. There was a small groove, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. I pressed it, and with a soft click, the entire section of shelving swung outward, revealing a dark passageway behind. I stood there, frozen in shock, staring into the darkness. The whispers, which had been a constant background noise, suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. Common sense told me to close the door, to call the police or at least Mr. Vance, but curiosity won out. I grabbed my phone for light and stepped into the passageway. The air was stale and musty, thick with the scent of age and decay. The passage was narrow, forcing me to turn sideways in some spots. It curved through the house, and I realized with growing unease that it ran behind all the walls, allowing someone to move unseen throughout the entire building. As I moved deeper into the hidden network of passages, the whispers started again. They were clearer now, more distinct. I could make out phrases. "She's here." "Fresh blood." "The master will be pleased." I wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of my room, but I was lost in the maze of passages, each turn looking the same as the last in the dim light of my phone. Then I saw it, a faint glow up ahead. I moved towards it, drawn despite my fear. The passage opened into a small room, lit by flickering candles. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center stood an altar of some kind, stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. But it was what I saw next that made my blood run cold. Pinned to one wall were dozens of photographs, and I recognized the people in them, the other tenants, myself, all of us going about our daily lives, unaware we were being watched. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But as I turned to flee, I found my exit blocked. Mr. Vance stood there, but he wasn't the kindly old man I'd met. His eyes were dark, pupil-less voids, and his gentle smile had transformed into a rictus grin of sharply pointed teeth. "Welcome, Jamie," he said, his voice a rasping growl that bore no resemblance to his usual soft tones. "We've been waiting for you to join us." I didn't think. I just reacted. I shoved past him, using the element of surprise to my advantage. I ran blindly through the passages, no longer caring about the direction, just desperate to get away. I could hear them behind me, not just Mr. Vance, but others. The whispers had become shouts, echoing off the walls, inhuman shrieks and the sound of many feet pounding after me. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I burst through an opening, tumbling out into my room. I'd somehow found my way back. Without hesitation, I slammed the hidden door shut and pushed the heavy dresser in front of it. I didn't stop to grab anything. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. I didn't stop running until I reached the campus police station, gasping and wild-eyed. They didn't believe me, of course. When they went to investigate, they found nothing. No hidden passages, no altar room, no evidence of anything unusual. Mr. Vance played the part of the concerned landlord perfectly, even suggesting that perhaps I'd had some sort of vivid nightmare. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I moved out that same day, leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't bear to go back into that room, to face that bookshelf and the horrors that lay behind it. In the weeks that followed, I tried to find out more about the house and its history. I discovered that it had been built in the late 1800s by a man rumored to be involved in occult practices. Over the years, there had been numerous disappearances connected to the house, tenants who had simply vanished without a trace. I went to the police again, armed with this information, but they dismissed it as urban legends and coincidences. Without any concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. So now, I'm left with nothing but my memories and my fears. I've moved to a new city, started a new program at a different university, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear whispers in my walls, scratching sounds that have no source. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a familiar figure, an old man with kind eyes and a gentle smile that hides sharp teeth and darker appetites. I don't know if what I experienced was supernatural or just the work of a very sick, very human monster. But I do know this. Evil exists in this world, hiding behind pleasant facades and lurking in the secret spaces we never think to look. So the next time you're house hunting and you find a place that seems too good to be true, trust your instincts. Look closely at the walls, listen for the whispers in the night, because you never know what horrors might be hiding just on the other side of that perfect room. As for me, I'll never again ignore the sounds in the walls. I'll never dismiss strange noises as just the settling of an old house, because now I know the truth. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes, they're the ones handing you the keys to your new home, inviting you into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The moment I realized the couple at the next table had vanished without a trace, I knew this wasn't going to be the relaxing cruise I'd hoped for. Little did I know, I was about to become entangled in a terrifying game of cat and mouse with a killer who walked among us, hiding in plain sight. My name's Alex, and I'd booked this Caribbean cruise as a much-needed break from my high-stress job in finance. 7 days of sun, sea, and relaxation. That's what the brochure promised. Instead, I got a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I lounged by the pool, sipped cocktails at the bar, and enjoyed the nightly entertainment. It was on the third night that things took a sinister turn. I was having dinner in the main dining room, enjoying the prime rib and making small talk with the elderly couple at my table. That's when I noticed them, a young couple 2 tables over. They caught my eye because they seemed to be arguing, the woman gesturing angrily while the man looked around nervously. I didn't think much of it at the time. Couples fight, even on vacation. I finished my meal and headed to the casino for a nightcap. It was the next morning at breakfast when I realized something was off. The couple's table was empty, their chairs pushed in neatly as if they'd never been there. I scanned the room, thinking maybe they'd moved, but there was no sign of them. "Excuse me," I asked our waiter. "The couple that was sitting there last night, have you seen them?" The waiter looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but that table was empty last night. No one's been assigned there yet." A chill ran down my spine. I knew what I'd seen. They had been there, arguing in hushed but heated tones. I couldn't have imagined it. Throughout the day, I kept an eye out for the couple, but they were nowhere to be seen. It was a big ship, sure, but not that big. People didn't just disappear on cruise ships, did they? That evening, I overheard a conversation at the bar that made my blood run cold. "Did you hear?" One woman whispered to her friend. "Another couple's gone missing. That's 3 now." My head snapped up. "Excuse me," I said, probably a bit too eagerly. "Did you say people have gone missing?" The women looked at me, then at each other nervously. "It's probably nothing," the first woman said. "Just rumors. You know how people talk on these ships." But I could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't just idle gossip. I spent the rest of the night asking around discreetly, piecing together the story. Over the past 2 days, 3 couples had seemingly vanished into thin air. No one had seen them disembark at any of the ports. Their rooms had been found empty, beds unslept in, possessions left behind. The ship's staff was tight-lipped about the whole thing. When I tried to ask a security officer about it, he brushed me off with a rehearsed speech about passenger privacy. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I found myself wandering the ship's decks in the early hours of the morning, the sea breeze cool against my face. That's when I saw him, a man struggling to lift something heavy over the ship's railing, something that looked disturbingly like a body bag. I ducked behind a lifeboat, my heart pounding. The man heaved, and there was a splash as whatever he'd been carrying hit the water. He looked around furtively, then hurried away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before I moved. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call ship security, but as I dialed, a hand clamped over my mouth. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice hissed in my ear. I felt the cold press of metal against my back. A knife. I was marched back to my cabin, my captor's hand never leaving my mouth. Once inside, he spun me around and I got my first good look at him. He was one of the ship's officers, his uniform neat and pressed. "You saw something you shouldn't have," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Now we have a problem." "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "What have you done with those couples?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm cleaning up some of the ship's undesirable elements. Can't have anything ruining the cruise experience, can we?" My mind reeled. This man, this officer sworn to protect the passengers, was behind the disappearances. But why? "You're insane," I said, backing away until I hit the wall. "You can't just make people disappear. Someone will notice." He laughed, a chilling sound. "People disappear all the time. Accidents happen at sea. It's tragic, really. But life goes on, and the cruises keep sailing." I realized with horror that this wasn't new to him. How long had this been going on? How many people had disappeared on his watch? "Now," he said, twirling the knife casually, "we need to decide what to do about you." I knew I had to act fast. If I didn't do something, I'd be the next body going over the railing. I glanced around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. That's when the ship's horn blasted, startling us both. In that split second of distraction, I made my move. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all my might. It connected with his head with a sickening crunch. He went down hard, the knife clattering to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he was out cold. I ran. I burst out of my cabin, sprinting down the corridor towards the main deck. I had to find help, had to tell someone what was happening. But as I ran, I realized the horrible truth. I didn't know who I could trust. If one officer was involved and there could be others, the entire crew could be in on it for all I knew. I made it to the purser's desk, gasping for breath. "Please," I panted, "you have to help me. There's a killer on board. He's making people disappear." The woman behind the desk looked at me with concern. "Sir, please calm down. What are you talking about?" I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in her eyes. I sounded crazy, and I knew it. "Sir, I think you should come with me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We have a doctor on board who can help you." "No, you don't understand," I shouted, drawing stares from nearby passengers. "We're all in danger." That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, ready to defend myself, only to find myself face to face with the ship's captain. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice authoritative. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words died in my throat. Standing just behind the captain was the officer from my cabin, a bandage on his head and murder in his eyes. In that moment, I knew I was truly alone. No one would believe me. It was my word against theirs, and they held all the cards. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran again. I pushed past the captain and sprinted towards the upper decks. I could hear shouts behind me, feet pounding in pursuit. I burst out onto the open deck, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The railing was just ahead. In a split second, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I jumped. The shock of the cold water drove the breath from my lungs. I surfaced, gasping, and watched as the ship's lights grew smaller in the distance. I had no idea if I'd survive the night in the open ocean, but I knew my chances were better than if I'd stayed on that ship of horrors. As I floated there, waiting for rescue or death, whichever came first, I couldn't help but wonder, how many other ships were out there, sailing placidly across the seas while hiding dark secrets in their depths? How many other killers walked among unsuspecting passengers, selecting their victims from the buffet line or the evening show? I was eventually rescued by a fishing boat, but my story was met with disbelief and suspicion. The cruise line denied everything, painting me as a mentally unstable passenger who had jumped overboard in a moment of crisis. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And now, years later, every time I see an ad for a luxury cruise, I can't help but shudder. Because I know the truth. Sometimes, the real danger isn't the vast ocean or the foreign ports. Sometimes, the killer is right there beside you, wearing a crisp uniform and a welcoming smile, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. So the next time you're considering a vacation at sea, remember my story. And ask yourself, are you really ready to be trapped in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to run and no one to trust? Because once that ship leaves port, you're at the mercy of whoever, or whatever, is on board with you.